transaction, for example, but it was more duration, not really likelihood of completion, that we were concerned about.
On the 10th of September 2009, you had drinks with Mr. Cameron at a place called the George, and the topic of the discussion was the Sun's proposed endorsement of the Conservative Party. Do you see that?
Yes.
Was it made clear to Mr. Cameron that the Sun would be endorsing the Conservative Party?
It was made clear to Mr. Cameron by me that after discussions with the editor and the leadership at News International and my father, that autumn, the Sun would either be endorsing the Conservative Party or certainly, moving away from its traditional or recent support of Labour, as it had been through the summer.
Yes. And this must have been welcome news to Mr. Cameron, wasn't it?
It seemed that way.
Yes. Did you discuss the timing of the Sun's endorsement?
We discussed doing it at the end of the plan that the editors had was that it would be at the end of the conference season if it happened, because the editors wanted to see what things came out of the conferences, particularly the Labour conference, whether or not they would, what they would say.
But wasn't there a discussion that we'll endorse you at the best possible moment, the worst possible moment for Mr. Brown, as it happens, the very day of his speech to the Labour Party conference? Was there a discussion on that basis?
I don't remember the specificity of that, but I just for clarity, I think it was the day after was the article that was really more focused on Labour's record than it was an endorsement of the Conservatives, the one that you're referring to that you put in the evidence. It was the day after the speech, and it was really about Labour's record.
Is it your evidence that either at that meeting or before you had not discussed regulatory issues with Mr. Cameron?
At that meeting, I certainly didn't.
But at previous meetings, have you discussed them?
I don't believe so, actually.
At later meetings with Mr. Cameron, we can see these on page 02864. They're general references to topical subjects, politics. Do you think regulation might have been discussed?
These are on the 7th of November and the 23rd of December?
No, they're before the election. It's on the second page of JRM 10, page 02864. I
think actually more politics just leading up to an election was more the topic. I don't believe we discussed any specific regulation, and certainly if anything came up, it would have been, entirely consistent with the public advocacy that I or the company had undertaken at that point.
Okay. Well, once he becomes Prime Minister, which was, as we record, in May of 2010, we recorded here 2 meetings with Mr. Cameron, back to JRM 9, page 02952. There's a lunch at Chequers with your family and other guests on the 7th of November 2010. One may accept it's a general social conversation. You don't recall any discussion of the B-Sky-B bid, do you?
Not of the B-Sky-B bid, no, not at all.
But then on the 23rd of December 2010, there was some discussion, according to your witness statement, of paragraph 3.19. Can we just be clear about this occasion? Was it at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Brooks?
Yes, it was. It was the 23rd of December at their home.
Yes. About how many people were there?
I can't remember the exact number, but it was in the teens, maybe a dozen, maybe 15 people.
It was 2 days after the revelation that Mr. Cable might not be approaching the B-Sky-B bid with an entirely open mind, if I can put it in that way.
Well, no, it was 2 days after Mr. Cable had been removed from his responsibilities with respect to it after showing acute bias.
Yes. Fair enough, Mr. Murdoch. You're entitled to put it in that way. So the issue, the fate of the bid, was very much in your mind on the 23rd of December 2010, wasn't it?
It was a big question mark about what would happen going forward, but there was no discussion with Mr. Cameron other than, as I've detailed in my witness statement, which is simply he reiterated what he had said publicly, which is that the behavior had been unacceptable, and I imagine I expressed the hope that things would be dealt with in a way that was, appropriate and judicial. Our only concern during this period was that the correct and appropriate legal test was applied to this transaction, and I would have said it to anyone who would listen. But it was a tiny side conversation ahead of a dinner where all these people were there, so it wasn't really a discussion, if you will.
So it just took a few moments. Is that right?
That's my recollection, yeah. And I included here for completeness.
Well, fair enough. Then other ministers meeting with Mr. Laws after you've kindly told us he resigned as Chief Secretary of the Treasury. So it was after the 29th of May 2010. Presumably after the bid was announced. Is that right?
Yes.
Was the purpose of the discussion to see if the Liberal Democrat part of the coalition could be brought on side?
No, not so much to be brought on side. I had been attempting and requesting to meet with the minister, Mr. Cable, in charge of the portfolio it's a quirk of the Enterprise Act in this area that the politician himself, the Secretary of State, holds the responsibility to make the decision. It's not a question of a regulator or an independent body or anything like that. It's the Secretary of State himself who can do that. I had been requesting a meeting with Mr. Cable. I was told that I wasn't able to have a meeting with Mr. Cable and his advisors, with our team as well, to talk about the transaction. So our people, I think, reached out to Mr. Cable's advisors, who suggested that we talk to various senior Liberal Democrats.
Can I ask you a general question about the timing of the bid? That we know from what's in the public domain that News Corp approached B Sky B regarding its interest in acquiring the publicly owned shares of B Sky B in June 2010. Is that correct?
That's right.
Which was 1 month thereabouts after the election. The internal consideration began the previous year. Was it part of the News Corp strategy to at least wait until the outcome of the election?
I think it was to wait until the election was completed, regardless of the outcome, such that a transaction of this size, some $12 billion, didn't become a political football, and that was the goal. But the primary driver for the timing was really the affordability of it, being able to do it. We had taken some time to really husband our resources carefully. It was contemplated that it would be an all-cash offer, and that took a little while to save up, if you will, after over a number of years. Also, there was a gap because in 2009, recall, with the financial crisis, with the uncertainty around the environment, large-scale mergers and acquisitions activity was a hard thing to get your head around. Yes. And so furthermore, in 2009, and forgive me, Mr. J, but it's important because I think I know you're going, but every summer the B Sky B board, the independent directors, meet together to talk through long-term strategy and the like, and we wanted to do it ahead of that or around that time when the board was all scheduled to have a few days together, so it could be done completely and properly with the board.
Yes. I think you said that you needed to save up over a number of years. Is that right?
Yes, the company did. Yes.
So it suggests that the B Sky B bid was, at least in embryo, over a number of years, wasn't it? Well,
in '09, in late '09, where we started to really have proper discussions about it, was where we were. But it was in 2007 the company acquired Dow Jones for $5.5 billion in cash, and to contemplate a transaction of this size in the immediate aftermath of that, and given what happened in 2008 and '09 with respect to the global financial crisis, would have been difficult. So in '09 and '10, we realized this was something that we could actually do.
Yes. And I'm sure there's a difference between aspiration and reality, but in terms of aspiration, Sky B had been on the radar of News Corp for a number of years, hadn't it?
Well, it had been more than on the radar. The company founded British Sky Broadcasting some 20-odd years ago.
Yes, but what I mean by that is the acquisition of the remaining publicly owned shares in Sky B. That had been on the radar for a number of years.
It had long been an aspiration since the merger with BSB.
When I refer to the outcome of the election and your desire to await that, part of your calculation, wasn't it, or was a preference at least for a Conservative victory?
I don't think it's controversial to say that, generally speaking, with respect to an approach to enterprise, the free market, and so on, that the Conservatives, tried to make a case that they were the better option for that.
Having committed the Sun to the Conservative Party on the 30th of September 2009, it would not have been a desirable outcome had there been a Labour victory, at least as regards the fate of the Sky B bid, would it?
I think it was never a calculation, the Sky B bid and the Sun, if that's what you're saying. We never made, and I would never have made that sort of kind of a crass calculation about what the newspapers did. It just wouldn't occur to me.
Well, you describe that as a crass calculation, but I would suggest you would make the sophisticated calculation of preference for a particular result in the general election as regards what might work best for the fate of the Sky B bid. You would at least do that, wouldn't you?
Oh, what might be best for the British economy in general, which would lead you to the view that you were happier or less happy to invest. And that was I don't know if my personal politics matter to you, but that would have been my view, yes.
Now, we know from your witness statement, paragraph 3.23.1, that you had telephone calls to or with Mr. Jeremy Hunt, who's the Secretary of State for Culture, Media, Olympics and Sport, on the 10th of November and the 15th of November 2010. It's our page 02962. You also say you don't recall whether the conversations related to Sky B. Is that correct?
That's right, I don't recall. There would have been a number of agenda items for the Minister for Culture, Media and Sport that, the company, that the Minister would have sought lots of input on from the industry in general, and that was where it was. He didn't have any authority or any remit with respect to the Sky B transaction at that time, but if I did say anything to him about it, it would have only been to, seek assurances that the appropriate legal test was applied and that this didn't become a political issue.
This was, I think, shortly after the European intervention notice, wasn't it?
I can't remember the exact date of the European intervention notice, but I do remember, I think it was, I can't remember, I can come back to you on that, but it was, I have a schedule of this. The European intervention notice, I'm sure you already know, Mr. J, but it's, was
4th of November.
Yes, 4th of November, yeah. So it was a little while after that.
Well, not that long after it, was it?
A week later.
Mr.
So it
Hunt,
might have come up with Mr. Hunt.
Yes, Mr. Hunt was, of course, a huge ally of News International, wasn't he?
I wouldn't describe it that way, no. I mean, I don't think so.
Well, according to what was then on his personal website, he was. You've seen that, haven't you, Mr. Murdoch?
Yes, I saw it in the evidence you put here. It was the first time I'd seen it.
Like all good Conservatives, Hunt is a cheerleader for Rupert Murdoch's contribution to the health of British television.
I don't think you have to be an ally. I don't think you have to be an ally of the business to conclude that. It's the fact.
Well, there's a bit of opinion wrapped up in that fact, isn't there, Mr.
The cheerleading part, yes, but the contribution has been significant.
I think the point I'm making, I hope very gently, is that Mr. Hunt was on side. It is true that he did not have, as it were, jurisdiction over the bid, because that lay with the Secretary of State for BIS, Mr. Vince Cable. But the purpose of the call, I would suggest to you, was to see if he could oil the wheels a bit. Isn't that right?
No, I don't think so. I think it would have been, and I don't remember those particular calls, but I think, there might have been a desire to update him on the process and what we were hearing. It might have been to say, to talk about everything from next generation access to others. I don't have the record in front of me. One call was about a meeting that he canceled at the last minute, and I think he apologized for having to cancel the meeting because his lawyers had told him not to, but I don't know if it's one of those calls.
Okay. Can I ask you please to look at tab 53 in the bundle we've prepared for you. It's our page 01962. It's a record of earlier meetings with Mr. Hunt before the election.
Tab 53, did you say? Sorry.
It is in my version of the bundle, but it might be tab 52 in your version. I'll give you time to find it up. To turn it up. It's the list of the meetings with...
I see them on the electronic system. Is that them?
It is, I hope. The first meeting on the 12th of October,
yes.
09, you discussed, amongst other things, the reform of Ofcom, didn't you?
I think he had, there's a whole agenda here of a number of things that were discussed.
Yes, and reform of Ofcom, of course, was one of them, wasn't it?
It's on the list there, yes.
And at the next meeting, 12th February 2010, New Communications Act, media regulation. Can you recall anything about that?
No, I think it was the opposition government's the opposition's view, and I think their stated platform that they were going to have think about in the first term, if they were elected, a new Communications Act, and I think even the Labour government had talked about updating the Communications Act as well. And look, this was to be a normal agenda around, Mr. Hunt describing what his agenda was largely around things like the local TV network, anti-piracy, around copyright, next generation access, etc. And I think he was on the, very publicly on the record of saying that he wanted to look at the system of regulation under DCMS as well, in particular Ofcom.
Yes, and then the last item of the agenda here is BBC funding structure and governance.
Yes.
So that also was discussed. I mean, did you, previously to this, persuade Mr. Hunt to drop what was then Tory policy to top slice the BBC licence fee?
No. I mean, look, I've never thought that top slicing was a good idea, and I've been very consistent about that and very transparent. And if I were asked, and I might have been at that meeting, I would have told him my views on top slicing, which is that it's not a very good idea, and it's better to keep an intervention concentrated and measurable, which was the same position that the BBC had as well.
Now, later on, after the election, in October 2010, there was a licence fee settlement with the BBC, where I think the upshot was that the licence fee was frozen for a number of years. Was that something which you discussed with any member of the Conservative or coalition government?
I don't remember if I did. But if I did, I would have said that they should have gone through a proper process. The schedule for renewing the license fee was the following year, when they could have consulted widely with the industry and stakeholders, and they didn't do it. I was very upset when they announced that settlement.
But regardless of the process, it was an outcome which was in the interest of B Sky B, wasn't it?
Not necessarily. I think the whole industry would have welcomed, including B Sky B, a process of wider consultation and discussion around something as important as that.
Did you have, in relation to Ofcom, any contact with ministers or officials in relation to the changes announced in October 2010 that reduced Ofcom's role and cut its budget by 28%?
No, I don't think so.
Again, was that an outcome which News Corps would have favoured?
Yeah, look, I've often said, and I've been very, very consistent about this, that, the scale of intervention by, particularly in media regulation, is very large, and I don't think there's anything that would surprise anyone about my views on that at this point. Anyway, I think most of Ofcom's bill gets put back to us anyway, so it wouldn't really make a difference.
Now, it's been said of you that you are, perhaps were, a close friend of Mr. Osborne. Is that right?
We have been friendly. I wouldn't say I was a close friend of his.
Because what one newspaper article says, well, you've got children of the same age, you get on well. This is a piece in The Guardian, as I think you're aware, dated the 30th of September 2009.
Which tab is it, Mr. J?
Tab 63 in my version of this bundle. I hope it's the same place.
Yes. As I've said, I'm friendly with Mr. Osborne, the Chancellor.
And have you been to the Chancellor of the Exchequer's sometimes described as grace and favour home at Dorneywood?
I have once, yes.
Have you had discussions with him at any stage about the B-Sky B bid?
I think I had one discussion where it might have come up, which was around the, which was during the process, which would have just been to be grumpy about it taking a long time and being referred to Ofcom, which I was very clear and public about at the same time. Nothing I would have said to Mr. Osborne would have been in any way inconsistent with our public advocacy on the subject.
Is it possible to differentiate, though, in any way between what you describe as your public advocacy and what takes place in private? The purpose of the former is obvious and entirely appropriate. The purpose of the latter may be said to seek to gain some unfair or covert advantage in relation to your opponents.
No, look, I don't think that would not be the way that I would do it. I'm pretty, I look at this and say, listen, I like to be direct. I like to have, a clear set sort of principles that might guide how we think about a marketplace working, what we do, what the regulation is like. I like to lay it out publicly. And if, views are sought or consulted on in those areas, I'll say the same thing. And I think, it's legitimate sort of advocacy, if you will, of positions that, for policymakers, that's important. And I think all business leaders would take the same approach, or I think they should.
The press clearly have an enormous megaphone, and they can promote the views that they think are correct. And the evidence of the 10th September meeting, which you've spoken of, was clearly very important. But do you think that you obtain greater access for yourself as a businessman because you have the weight of press interests behind you?
I certainly don't know what all of the other meetings that the Prime Minister or these people take in general. I think it's true to say that politicians and people around the political class, if you will, are very, very eager to get their points across, and they definitely like to talk to the press. And we've seen the schedule of the Prime Minister's meetings with all the different journalists, editors, proprietors, etc. There's a lot there. But from the standpoint as a business person, I don't think I've personally experienced that, because actually I haven't actually spent that much time with politicians personally. And certainly most of my interaction with these politicians has been around British Sky Broadcasting, where the sort of politics of news and things like that don't really fit in. And the vast majority of my career has been as making television here.
Oh, I understand that, but do you think it might have been an advantage when you've been discussing B-Sky B and making television, and the contribution that B-Sky B has made, that actually News International have other interests which have been capable of at least potentially making a difference.
I don't think there's any evidence of an advantage with respect to the way we've operated our business and the way that the business has been regulated and governed in the country. I just don't think, I really just don't think that's there. I think it's a question perhaps for the politicians about how they saw it, but certainly for me, I would really, I just wouldn't link the two. I just would never do that. I think the press and the newspapers have to make the decisions on behalf of their readers and in the context of the country and what they think is right. And, I need to be able to win the argument, if you will, for British Sky Broadcasting or others, or I did at the time, on the merits of the business and of the legal case, if it's a merger or other things like that. And that's all I would ever seek to do.
In your discussions with politicians before the general election, in particular the last one, was it not obvious to you that they were very interested in whether you would be supporting their party in due course?
I don't think I was ever asked directly about that.
That wasn't the question. The question is whether it was obvious to you that they would be very interested in knowing whether your newspapers would support their party in due course.
I think all politicians would be interested to know that and would seek the support of newspapers and the media. That's very much part of the way they see their job as communicators, and to use for Justice Leveson's phrase, to be able to avail themselves of that megaphone, if you will, for their own policies and purposes. I think that's reasonably evident.
But in terms of, there's a ever-changing balance of power here, but in a run-up to an election, it must occur to you as a sophisticated individual that the balance of power is more with you than with them, because they are so interested in knowing whether your newspapers are going to support them. Would you agree with that?
I hope that's not the case, because, I hope that they don't think that's the case, because we live in an environment of just such extraordinary choice in media sources. We look at customers multi-sourcing variety of news from all over the place. I just don't think that there's that kind of the very old-fashioned sort of view, if you will, of kind of big media proprietors and being able to dominate the landscape. When I don't think that exists anymore. I think in Westminster sometimes it might feel that people still believe that.
Well, that's
but
right.
I just think it's not the case.
Well, Mr. Murdoch, I'm not actually concerned with reality, because one could never prove.
Pardon me. Sorry.
Well, I'm not so sure that you mean that.
Well, no, I
or at least you may not be, but I certainly am.
One could never, let me put it in these terms, one could never prove that because a newspaper, even one as important as The Sun, supports a political party, that has a causative effect on the outcome of an election. But in terms of perception, I think you've just confirmed this through your last answer, that politicians believe that, don't they?
Whether or not they believe it, I think it doesn't change the fact, as I think Justice Leveson was suggesting, that they seek, and that I would suggest, I don't think I've ever had a conversation with a politician where he or she didn't try to convince me of the rectitude of their views. I think that's true of pretty much anyone they talk to, but I would say probably particularly people with any, direct or even indirect relationship with the press.
So are you agreeing or disagreeing with me that there's at least a perception in the minds of politicians that the support of a paper such as The Sun is or may be important?
I can agree with you that there may be, if that's the question, but I think really it's a question for them.
But in terms of your analysis of the timing of something like the B-Sky B bid, weighing up the pros and cons, it would be part of your assessment, wouldn't it, as to the power you can exercise over politicians at a critical time, which is in the run-up to an election?
No, absolutely not. It would not be a part of our assessment that we would exercise our power over politicians that you believe is there. That is not the case.
Because, of course, after the election, the tables are turned somewhat, that the power is more with the politicians, isn't it? Particularly if you need their help in relation to a commercial project such as the acquisition of the remaining shares of B-Sky-B.
Well, I wouldn't concede that the table was there to turn, Mr. Jay, as I said earlier. So I think the power is with the law of the land and the policymakers around it. And you have to assess the environment and whether or not, an investment is advisable or not. And you have to assess the regulatory environment and try to play as straight a bat, as you can, or a very straight bat indeed.
Well, I'm sure a straight bat is usually the best way forward. But you accepted some time back, Mr. Murdoch, this morning, that the way these bids are dealt with in the regulatory sphere is not just a legal issue, it is also a political issue, isn't it?
Well, I think there's always the risk that a transaction or business activity can be politicized, if you will, and that concerns around the environment around something can be there. Yes, that's the case.
But it's more than a risk, that if you look at the history in relation to News International, whether it's 1981 with the Times, 1987 with Today, 1990 with the original merger of the two companies, there has always been a political debate which has gone on in parallel with or alongside the legal or substantive debate, hasn't there?
I think unfortunately there has been a political debate. And my concern, as I've been involved in business in this country, has always been to try and keep the debate on the legal side and actually to look at facts and merits, and I'm pretty square on this, and be consistent with respect to, how we legislate, how we regulate industries, and how ultimately we can create, an environment for better investment and more jobs in these industries. That's been my concern. But
you'd be aware, Mr. Murdoch, that although doubtless you'd wish to keep the debate solely to the legal issues, that it would be inevitable that the debate would spill over onto the political domain, wouldn't you?
Well, as I said, But may I ask you to clarify, Mr. Jay, because I don't really understand. There are many debates. So there's debates around whether or not a transaction may or may not act against the public interest, which we dealt with last year. There are debates around how sports rights are sold. There are debates around, and then there are debates around politics. And sometimes politicians can have a view. I mean, we definitely, when we started to invest heavily in domestic English cricket at B-Sky-B, there was a political angle. Early day motions, people saying it should be kept free to air and all of those things. And I felt my job really at that time, as it is now, was to say no. From a legal perspective, it's entirely appropriate for English cricket to be broadcast on Sky from the standpoint of the sport, from the standpoint of fans, and so on and so forth. So I always try to bring it back to what's legally sound, what are the right arguments for industry, and to try to make the political debate, one that's less relevant, because it sometimes isn't based in what's right or legal or where the right jurisdiction is.
Okay, can I touch on one other politician? It's the First Minister of Scotland, Mr. Alex Salmond. You had lunch with him in January 2011, and there's a letter which followed on the 25th of January 2011 for Mr. Salmond. Do you recall that?
Do I have that letter in my
I think it's in your tab
bundle?
Maybe in your tab 92.
Just let me have a look.
Tab 92 is
There's our tab 93 in Mr. Rupert Murdoch's bundle, unfortunately. It's been... You may not have it.
The letter in January, yes.
Have you got those to hand?
Yes.
How many people do B-Sky-B employ in Scotland?
Oh, some thousands. I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but I can come back to you with the exact number, but 5,000 or 6,000, if not more.
I think I've seen reference somewhere to as many as 18,000.
The 18,000 is the total British Sky Broadcasting direct employment base. There's more that are indirect.
In relation to him, after the 2007 election, when the Sun in Scotland did not support his party, News International and Mr. Salmond, his party, became closer, didn't they?
In 2007, that was before I was there, I'm afraid, so I don't...
That's part of the history, but
I don't know what the relationship was like.
Okay.
I only met him much more recently than that.
Okay. Can I deal with one discrete issue? It's tab 67 of the bundle we put together for you. It's an event which allegedly took place at the Independent. Independent,
yes.
You'll recall this.
Yes, I recall the story.
They say that you went round to the Independent's offices and swore at them, owing to an article which said Rupert Murdoch won't decide this election, you will. Is that true or not?
That's not correct, Mr. J. Would you mind, may I just give you my version of events?
Well,
is that what you'd like?
Succinctly, tell us what happened, Mr. Murdoch.
I'd had a meeting in the building. They're in the same building as Associated Newspapers, and I had a meeting at Associated, which is in the article. We went downstairs. They had and I was upset and concerned because the Independent had not run an article about this, but had put up a lot of giant billboards around England with that I'd seen pictures of with that message: Rupert Murdoch won't decide this election. And I thought they were really personalizing an agenda against my father and my family that I found inappropriate. Mm-hmm. I'm always a direct person, and I think if you have the opportunity to tell someone to their face that you have an issue, it's much better than whispering or saying upset to somewhere else, particularly because I knew Mr. Kellner, and I was concerned about it. So I went into the front door of the Independent, and they didn't really have a desk or a reception area, so you're automatically, or a lock, frankly, so you're automatically in the middle of the newsroom, which I wasn't intending to do. I didn't storm in anywhere. I found Mr. Kellner, who was at one of the desks there, and I said, could we speak to you for a minute? And then we went into his private office and shut the door, and I told him of my concerns, and whether or not I used colorful language, I wouldn't dispute. But certainly there was no storming, and none of this happened out in the open in the newsroom, and I was particularly upset because Mr. Kellner had particularly been, availing himself of the hospitality of my family for years, and I thought this was beyond the pale and not a decent way to go about his business.
Before we look at the detail of the BSkyB bid, can I ask you about the issue of specialist advisors? Was Mr. Osborne's specialist advisor, known as SPAD, his Harrison, is he known to you?
I don't have any recollection of Mr. Harris. I just don't know. News
Corps' head of corporate communications, someone called Mr. Matthew Anderson. Would it be fair to describe him as a lobbyist?
No, Mr. Anderson is a communications and marketing executive who deals with public affairs, which would be, as you say, lobbying. The public affairs people who interface with government would report into Mr. Anderson alongside brand, marketing, press people as well.
As a means of improving the prospects of the BSkyB bid, did you instruct Mr. Anderson to have contact with any of the specialist advisors of Mr. Hunt or Mr. Osborne?
I think there was a regular, generally speaking, at the public affairs level, it was Mr. Michel who reported to Mr. Anderson. At that time, who dealt with direct contact with the political level with special advisors and people of people of that nature. To my knowledge, that's where that was sort of the PO box for the company there.
In terms of how News Corps and News International operate, we're going to hear obviously from your father tomorrow. We were going to hear that he has some meetings with politicians. We know that you have some meetings with politicians. You've told us about them. But particularly in period 2008 to general election in May 2010, would it be fair to say that Mrs. Brooks, as it were, bore the brunt of the majority of meetings with politicians because of her relationship with politicians?
I've seen the schedule, I think, of the Prime Minister's meetings in that period, or I can't remember exactly, but she would have been closer to those issues than I was.
And was it part of the general way of working, as it were, that Mrs. Brooks might report back to you as to the outcome of any discussions or the fact of any discussions with politicians, and then you would report anything important back to your father?
From time to time, she would report to me about a discussion that was relevant, but she would also communicate directly with my father, with some frequency.
Now, when you had discussions internally, particularly in September 2009, within the Sun, you cover this at paragraph 8.6 of your statement, and those discussions involved the political editor of the Sun and Mrs. Brooks and yourself, and I think your father may have been involved as well. Did the discussions involve any assessment of who might win the next election?
The discussions in late 2009 or whenever it was, or the summer around that, there was a question of what the Sun's position would be. Through that summer, if you recall, there was quite a lot of back and forth, and the Sun was writing extensively about their view on the management of the conflict in Afghanistan of British troops, etc., and that was of some general interest at the time. And there was and leading up to the decision around not supporting the Labour Party after having supported them in 2 elections previously before I was there. I was involved in some of those discussions really around what the paper's position would be, not necessarily the likelihood of who would win, but obviously, in those meetings we would have been someone would have said, well, the polls say this, or it's like this and that, and, that sort of business.
So that in particular was why the political editor was there, wasn't it? So that you could be advised as to the likely outcome of the next election, so far as anybody could assess such an imponderable.
But also to hear the relevant journalist's view on the individuals involved, the quality of their policies, how he thought the readership and the readers, were feeling, to have input.
So the decision is multifactorial, but one factor amongst many is who's going to win. Is that fair?
Yes, I think you try to see the mood of the country.
Okay, now the B-Sky-B bid itself, you cover this in paragraph or section 3 of your statement, which begins at 02957. This is quite intricate, Mr. Murdoch, and a lot of it we don't need to delve into, although we're grateful for you setting out the history here. But in terms of the legal position, have I got this right? There was a competition aspect which would be dealt with in Europe, as it were, and a plurality aspect which would be dealt with by the Secretary of State. So far, so good?
Yes, there was the opportunity for the competition aspect to be requested, for the member state jurisdiction in the UK to request jurisdiction of that, but it was seen as an unlikely scenario that it would be granted anyway, as this was primarily a merger of European television platforms.
Now, the competition aspect within Europe was resolved in Nucall's favour in December 2010, wasn't it? Indeed, the date is the 21st of December.
Well, it was resolved without having found that the theories of harm were relevant or credible.
So in terms of the law, we were left with the plurality aspect, which I understand contingently or separately might have a separate competition issue, but let's concentrate on the plurality aspect. And News Corp's position was, well, owing to what happened a couple of years previously in litigation involving the Competition Commission, which went up to the Court of Appeal, a decision had already been made that there was really no plurality issue because News Corp already owned 39.1% of the issued share capital of B Sky B. Is that correct?
It's correct that that was one of the things that was relevant to that, but we didn't simply rely on that precedent, which was, in fact, that was the precedent, but also on the merits, on the underlying facts of the case with respect to an assessment of plurality in the marketplace between 2003, when the relevant provisions were put into law, and 2010, when it was to be tested again. Because the test is around the sufficiency of plurality, the sufficiency of the number of news providers in a marketplace.
So can we agree this much, Mr. Murdoch, that certainly from News Corp's perspective, whether or not News Corp were right, but News Corp may well have been right, News Corp had a good case in law on the plurality issues?
That was the advice that we received, and that is my belief.
But I think, as we've also accepted, that running along parallel lines was this potentially explosive political issue. The political issue was generated by the fact that there were people out there who headed in for News Corporation and News International. That's right, isn't it? Well,
it was more than that, Mr. J. It was not just a political issue, it was a commercial issue. And the point you made before about there being competition dimensions to plurality was a very relevant point here. The press outside of News Corporation, the other newspaper proprietors in the marketplace, had a very, very distinct commercial fear around bundling and cross-promotion in particular, and around the size and scale of News Corporation's interests in the UK if the acquisition had been completed. That is a pure competition argument. They turned that very effectively into an argument that the future competitiveness of their enterprises would be at risk if this new competitor were present, and therefore plurality was at a risk at some point in the future. That's a dynamic assessment of plurality that has nothing to do with the relevant legal test. So it is relevant, and it's important to note that it is commercial, not simply political, and in fact it is primarily commercial.
From the point of view of your competitors, that's right. But if you're looking at the perspective of politicians, because there are politicians out there, some are cheerleaders for News International, and we've seen reference in someone's personal website to that effect, and others possibly who aren't so warmly disposed to News Corp, News International. You must agree with that.
Yes, that's true. There are differences of outlook.
So the purpose of any lobbying which is going to take place is to try and ensure that those who are on side remain on side, and perhaps communicate things to you, and try and win over those who are not on side. Is that right?
I think in any situation, any business is going to try to advocate the merits of its case, be it an investment case or a regulatory case, to a wide audience of policymakers who may or may not be in a position to have some input into it.
In terms of the chronology, which I am going to take quite shortly, I mean, those who wish to study it, I would invite them to read your witness statement, which will be put online, and there are no points of fact which I would wish to dispute in terms of what happened publicly. That you've already referred to this, 21st December 2010, the then responsible Secretary of State, responsible in a quasi-judicial role for determining the bid, Mr. Vince Cable, was replaced because he was reported as saying that he had declared war on Mr. Murdoch.
Yes, among other things.
Yeah. And then Ofcom reported on the 31st of December 2010, this is paragraph 3.13, in a way which wasn't altogether favourable to the bid. They were, in effect, recommending a reference to the Competition Commission, weren't they?
Yes, that's right.
And Ofcom were perhaps in the camp, and you perceive them to be such, of being slightly hostile to the interests of International News Corp rather than being one of its cheerleaders. Would you agree?
I think it's important not to conflate News International and News Corp here.
No, it's always News Corp. It's always News Corp.
The primary engagement with Ofcom was around British Sky Broadcasting in our history. They are the relevant regulators since they were set up. And look, it's fair to say that, and we made extensive submissions to this point to Ofcom and to DCMS and to the OFT, that we had real issues with their analysis.
Okay.
And I've included that in my evidence.
Now, there were two, once Mr. Hunt acquired responsibility for adjudicating on the bid, there were two, I can describe them as formal meetings with him. They are minuted. They're in the bundle. The first is on the 6th of January 2011, which is JRM 5. It's our tab 6, I think.
Mm-hmm.
We can identify the personnel present. So I don't think this is this your note or the Secretary of State's notes? Do you know?
I believe this is the Secretary of State's notes. This is the minutes from DCMS. I think so. I think that's what it says.
Well, the Secretary of State is there. Various other persons within his department. His specialist advisor, Mr. Adam Smith, is there. Do you see that, Mr. Murdoch? He's someone who's going to feature somewhat in the narrative. And then in terms of your team, the News Corp team, someone called Mr. Frederick Michel is there. He's the Director of Public Affairs, and his role was to lobby in support of the bid, wasn't it?
Well, on various issues, he was the liaison with policymakers. That's what a public affairs executive does.
Had he been hired in May 2009?
I can't remember when he precisely started.
The detail of this is not going to matter much, but the Secretary of State indicated, on the basis of Council's advice, that he was minded to refer to the Competition Commission. There was then consideration given internally to offering undertakings. Mm-hmm. Those were offered on the 18th of January 2011, and the purpose of offering them was to remove or at least mitigate the plurality concerns, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. Essentially, the Secretary of State had said he had received the advice from Ofcom that said that he should refer the thing. It's within his remit under this particular part of the Enterprise Act for him to take that and weigh it up with any undertakings that might or might not be able to deal with the issues. Given the length of time that the Competition Commission review would take, we decided rather than go through the lengthy process of trying to win the arguments with the Competition Commission, we would simply offer an undertaking that solved the issue, even though we didn't concede that there was an issue there. And the undertaking was a substantial structural undertaking around separating Sky News from the transaction entirely, not changing its ownership structure at all, and investing ample, significant sums in its continuing operation over a 10-year period. So it was a major concession that the Secretary of State had extracted in the process.
And there was another meeting with the Secretary of State and his officials and specialist advisor and your advisors on the 20th of January 2011, which I don't think we need look at, but the question of undertakings was certainly mentioned. Mm-hmm. What happened subsequently is that Ofcom were asked for advice. There was a public consultation. There was some issue about the undertakings, and therefore you revised the undertakings. A second consultation was launched on the 30th of June 2011 for a period ending on the 8th of July 2011. But then unfortunately, on a number of levels, the Millie Dowler story was published on the 4th of July 2011. Is all that more or less correct?
Yes.
As you frankly and clearly state in your statement that really the atmosphere was such that the only commercial decision you could take at that stage was to withdraw the bid. And that's what you did. Thank you. Well, that gives us the framework. We're now going to look at some evidence your father provided in response to a statutory notice. But as that evidence relates to emails and material which was sent to you and your father had no direct involvement with it, it's more appropriate that we deal with it with you, Mr. Murdoch. This is KRM 18.
Mr. J, I think some of them were sent to me, but not all of them.
Not all of them were sent to you.
Just for clarity.
But you've had an opportunity to review them.
Yes, I have, just recently.
Now, KRM 18 runs to 163 pages, but it requires a word of introduction. It's this, that there is a witness statement. I mentioned Mr. Frederick Michel about 5 minutes ago. He has put in a witness statement on the 18th of April 2012. And he makes the point, and therefore let's proceed on this basis, at least presumptively, that he's correct, that in relation to the period 24th December 2010 to July 2011, conversations which, or exchanges which, at least on the face of this material, appear to have taken place with the Secretary of State, in fact took place with the Secretary of State's Specialist Advisor, Mr. Adam Smith. You follow me, Mr. Murdoch?
Yes, I'm following you, yeah.
So with that health warning, if it be one, we can have a look now at this exhibit. The other important health warning is that it's sometimes difficult to understand this material without knowing what was going on in terms of the currency of the bid and the formal, albeit commercially confidential information which Allen and Overy, on behalf of News Corps, were submitting to the Secretary of State and Ofcom. So at appropriate times I will introduce that, so that at least we understand precisely where we are with this material. Now, the first page is 01642, page 1 on the internal numbering. The 15th of June 2010. This appears to be a conference call involving you and Mr. Michel and Mr. Cable, is that right?
That's correct. I'm not sure if I recall Fred being on the telephone or not, but he was there with me. It was a direct call to Mr. Cable from me on the day that we announced the proposal to make an offer.
Vince Cable call went well. He did say he thought, quotes, there would not be policy issue in this case. And then Mr. Michel has written, we should have recorded him, exclamation mark. Well, in a sense that is ironic on at least two levels. He didn't seem much on top of it. He'd seen the newspapers but not the announcement. JRM, that's you of course, told him in relation to the size of our group, etc. Cable appreciated. Can I ask you about this a bit lower down? Cable said he was coming as planned tomorrow evening. Do you recall what that's about?
I think it's the annual we have had the custom of doing in June around this time, and sort of a summer party for pretty much everyone. It's advertisers, some politicians, partners, executives in the business, etc., their spouses, and so on.
Okay.
It's like a big party that we throw.
The next page, 01643, this is again Mr. Michel to you. Mr. Anderson is copied in, and we've discussed who he is. So it's Mr. Michel speaking. Had a call from Hunt's advisor. This is at a time when Mr. Hunt had no role in relation to the decision. Is that correct?
That's correct. He didn't have a role in the decision until the end of December.
That's right. Said there shouldn't be media plurality issue and believed the UK government would be supportive throughout the process, brackets, despite what the Standard, for example, is suggesting this evening. Keen for Jeremy, that's obviously Mr. Hunt, to hear your feedback on his speech when you meet. And then there's reference to a speech. So it's pretty clear that you were receiving information along the lines that the UK government as a whole would be supportive of News Corp. Is that right?
I think Mr. Hunt had publicly said at some point around this time that he personally didn't see any issues, but that the relevant Secretary of State would be handling it. So I don't think there's no special information or anything like that in there. And again, I think it looks to me like there were other items on the agenda, as I had said, things like next generation access, which is the NGA notion, etc. And there was a normal sort of customary back and forth between a public affairs executive and people at DCMS on a regular basis.
Although it's right that certainly in law the decision lay exclusively with the responsible Secretary of State, isn't the message here from Mr. Hunt's advisor that to the extent appropriate or perhaps even inappropriate, the UK government would be supportive throughout the process?
Well, I mean, I don't think it is necessarily inappropriate at all. I think it's just, this is one part, the DCMS part of the government, saying, look, we don't see any issues here. We'll probably be, it's going to be fine, which is consistent with what Mr. Cable had told me on the telephone. It was an attempt to, a public affairs executive often tries just to listen and then reports back what he hears. People call around topical issues around the business. If there's a transaction, particularly if there's a particular regulatory or policy outcome that could be bad, for example, a big intervention or something like that. And a public affairs executive is the point person for those officials to have discussions.
Okay. As we move through this bundle, we're going to see, in fact, none of your replies to these emails from Mr. Michel. The reason being that it was difficult to prepare the bundle, apparently, in a way which would include them. They have been made separately available to me, and they'll be published online as soon as possible. None of your replies is of any interest, apart from one, and that I will come to in due course.
Okay.
Are we agreed? The next page, it's Mr. Michel again. Jeremy just called. So it looks as if it's Mr. Hunt speaking directly to Mr. Michel. Would you agree?
I think I don't know who he spoke to. Again, I wasn't on this. I'm not copied on this email, so this is one that I don't have any direct knowledge of at the time. This is Mr. Jacobs, who is the general counsel of News Corp globally, who is very closely involved in the regulatory and legal process here. Mr. Parker, who is the European level general counsel, regional, and Andrea Pella, the regulatory affairs lawyer for Europe as well.
But it looks as if you had a chat with Mr. Hunt on the 15th of June 2010, doesn't it?
Yes, and I think that corresponds to the record that we saw earlier, does it not?
Believe so, but it's not critical. Was the B-Sky B bid discussed during that chat? Do you remember?
I don't remember. It was in those days around the announcement of the bid, so I'd be surprised if it weren't. And I would have taken the same position that we had taken publicly and that I took with anyone who would listen.
Okay. The next page, 01645, we're moving now to the 28th of July 2010. I mean, you're not involved in this. This wasn't copied into you, it appears, Mr. Murdoch. But we can see what Mr. Cable was apparently saying, or reported as saying, by people very close to him. He's very keen to be seen as the most pro-competition Secretary of State, and as we know, he's very much anti-regulation. On our particular issue, he strongly believes the deal doesn't change the market situation or would have any impact on media plurality. So either Mr. Cable changed his mind, or the sources close to him were flatly wrong.
I think he actually said later on that all of the advice that he received, around the official advice from Whitehall, he described it, was very, very clear that there were no issues. He said that in the newspaper interview in July of 2011. And I think I've submitted in evidence from a Freedom of Information request the advice from his advisors at the time, which drew the same conclusion after consultation with Ofcom and the OFT. So I think that would have been the advice he was gotten. He later referred to receiving other advice, I don't know what it was, that obviously, informed him to act differently.
Okay, the next page, 01646, 15th of September 2010. Mr. Michel, to your advisor, but you're copied in. It relates to a blog that Mr. Robert Peston had put online to the effect that Ofcom was expected to review News Corp bids for Sky, which plainly would be of concern to you. But what Mr. Michel is saying, Jeremy Hunt is not aware and thinks it's not credible at all. He's checking now. So Mr. Michel is finding out, either from Mr. Hunt or his specialist advisor, what Mr. Hunt's view is about this blog. Are we agreed?
It seems that he's trying to find out if Mr. Peston's information is credible. Somebody from Hunt's advisor or whomever. And it's important to put in context, during this time, I was repeatedly seeking an official proper meeting with Mr. Cable so that I could make the legal case and give the business rationale, and we were not able to have that meeting, so we had very limited means of communicating.
So the way you did communicate was through your cheerleader, Mr. Hunt, to find out what was happening around this bid.
No, I think that's
right?
I think that's unfair. Mr. Michel, as a diligent public affairs executive, communicated with many people across the political spectrum, as is evidenced in this exhibit.
He picked up Mr. Peston's posting at 17:22, and 7 minutes later was already reporting that he'd checked through to DCMS. Is that fair?
I think that's what the codes say. Yeah. He had asked. It was of some concern, Mr. Peston's report, and Mr. Michel would have called who he could to find out if it was true. Yeah. That would have been his job.
I can quite understand your mindset, Mr. Murdoch, that you weren't getting anywhere with Mr. Cable. At least that was your perception. So let's find out what's happening with other secretaries of state who might be able to come to your assistance, and that's what you instructed Mr. Michel to do.
No, I think this email, Mr. J, doesn't show that at all. It simply says this was simply trying to find out if it's true.
Okay. I move forward a couple of pages to 01648.
I don't have those numbers, I think,
Number 7
Mr. J.
on the internal numbering.
Okay, thank you.
This one seems to be out of sequence, I'm afraid. I apologise for that. I should have spotted this earlier. It's the 23rd of June 2010. Vince has been advised by his team it would be better to meet with you once things have settled down on the Sky process in order to avoid any media questions on the purpose content of the meeting.
That's making the point that Mr. Murdoch made a moment ago, was that he wasn't able to have a meeting with Mr. Cable, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes, and I wanted a proper meeting, the kind that you described before, as minuted, etc. I wanted to be able to formally make my case to the Secretary of State.
And Mr. Michel found out some more about Mr. Cable, or at least his department's view, at 01649, the email of the 27th of September 2010.
This is like to be page 8 if you're just working on a different
Yes.
document.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Michel spoke to Mr. Cable's, it was probably his junior minister who sat in the Lords, who I think is Lord Oxshott, isn't it? Have I got the right individual? Lord Oakshott.
I now read this to say that it is Lord Oakshott that he was talking to, but I don't know. It doesn't say that in here. I might not have known that at the time.
The one point that particularly interesting, if you look at the second bullet point, he's thinking through the media plurality aspects of the transaction, influenced by three main issues which are colouring his judgment. The way Sky News handled the general election coverage and quality of news debate. Then there's reference to News of the World ongoing saga, and then a very strong, pure political pressure from Lib Dems and Labour over the way the Murdoch press has treated his own party policies and Labour over the past 12 months. So this looks as if a strong political flavour, as perhaps was entirely predictable, was entering into this process. Would you agree?
Yes, and it was very alarming because none of those three bullet points have anything to do with the proper legal test and the question of the sufficiency of plurality.
But this was maybe said to be part of the risk you took, that the way your press treated the Lib Dems and Labour over the previous 12 months had not been exactly favourable. All the more reason to hope for a Conservative victory and not have the Conservatives saddled to the Lib Dems, as indeed had occurred.
Mr. J, it was perfectly reasonable and indeed appropriate for me to have an expectation that a government minister acting in a quasi-judicial role would take into account the appropriate evidence, would look at it properly and apply the right test, and not get into this stuff. And you can call me naive about it, but I thought actually that these senior ministers are serious people who try to do their jobs.
But this is, Mr. Murdoch, this is absolutely key. You have one government minister who says, I don't like the way the Murdoch press has behaved, and I'm going to hold that against them. But the obverse of that is another government minister, Mr. Hunt, who is treated in a rather different way by the Murdoch press. His thinking is going to be exactly the converse to Mr. Cable's, and that is all part of your calculation, isn't it?
I don't think there's anything in Mr. Hunt's communication in here that would suggest that he did anything other than apply, way later on in this process, when it was negotiating the undertaking in lieu, that at every turn Mr. Hunt took the advice of the independent regulators, Ofcom and the OFT in particular, at every single decision point.
So the point I put to you didn't really enter into your calculation at all. That you've told us that you're outraged by what you read here in relation to Mr. Cable, yet the obvious converse of that is that you'd expect someone you did support to show you favour rather than disfavour.
That's
it all fits together, doesn't it?
I'm sorry, Mr. J, that is absolutely not the case, and the question of support of an individual newspaper for politicians one way or another is not something that I would ever link to a commercial transaction like this, nor would I expect that political support one way or another ever to translate into a minister behaving in an inappropriate way, ever. I simply wouldn't do business that way.
Okay, Mr. Murdoch. Page 10 on your internal numbering, our page 01651. We're just going to note this one because you weren't sent it. It's just one of the bullet points here. About 2/3 of the way down it says, advised to brief all the key Lib Dems in coming weeks and go through the impact of the transaction is the key, since it was made clear that the media agenda has had a very negative influence on the decision-making process. Are you with me on that one?
Yes.
And maybe Mr. Laws was part of that briefing process, wasn't it?
And I can't remember the date of the Laws meeting, so I don't know. But certainly, we were advised. This is Mr. Cable's advisor, and his advice being given to, and he was advising, saying, "Listen, the way I read this is Mr. Cable quote hasn't himself seen the arguments in details, but he's basically taking a political view." And this advisor says, "I advise you to brief all the key Lib Dems in coming weeks." And given the fact that this was coming from Vince Cable's advisor, that's what Mr. Michel would have tried to do as a public affairs executive, to try and be reactive to the advice he was getting from the Secretary of State's people.
So would that be a convenient moment to
Yes, certainly. We'll say 2 o'clock. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Yes.
Mr. Murdoch, the emails at pages 16 and 17, 01657, 01658, didn't go to you. It's clear that behind the scenes efforts were made to work out who was the best person to speak to close to Mr. Cable, who therefore could be lobbied. The answer came at 01659, page 18, which is an email which did go to you. Mission accomplished. This is Mr. Michel, of course, to you. The Lib Dem MP, former Sky employee with major Sky customer centres in his constituency and around, will contact Vince Cable to ask him to bear in mind the economic investment point of view rather than getting influenced by political games, especially in times of austerity and very difficult economic environment for those areas. He will also emphasise the opportunity for Cable to show the maturity of the Lib Dems as coalition partners working for the long term, and will draw from the coalition government experience Lib Dems have had in Scotland. And then we can see the second bullet point. Alex Salmond is very keen to also put these issues across to Cable, and have a call with you tomorrow or Wednesday. His team will also brief the Scottish press on the economic importance of News Corps for Scotland. I think you did have a conversation with Mr. Salmond about it, didn't you, Mr. Murdoch?
I think I did, but Mr. J, I think you characterized page 18, the note that starts mission accomplished,
yes,
as somehow the answer to who to talk to with respect to Mr. Cable. And I don't think the two are related. For clarity, I think the 16 is Vince's main advisor suggesting that Lord Oakeshott be contacted or others, or and then this is a separate point on 18, which is Mr. Michel, who basically started speaking to some Scottish politicians where, as we discussed earlier, British Sky Broadcasting is a major employer, to make some of the economic arguments with respect to investment. I think we have to recall that this merger was about the creation of a pan-European digital television platform with major operations in the United Kingdom, and particularly that meant potentially quite a lot of operations and an increase in operations in Scotland, where technical support, IT, service centres, etc., were located for British Sky Broadcasting as an important employer there. And it's entirely straightforward and normal for a business to reach out to advocate legitimately the economic benefits of a transaction or business as it were. I don't see that there's anything related to the other piece in this email. This is just legitimate advocacy.
Did you, as part of that process, have any discussion with Alex Salmond shortly thereafter?
I had a discussion with Alex Salmond at some point in here, making many of the same points as well as I'm sure other agenda items.
Okay. Can we just look at your page 21, our page 01662? Not an email you were copied in on. Vince's advisor just called me unprompted. We discussed the state of the process. He promised to make sure he has read the BIS submissions by Thursday afternoon. He will then schedule a face-to-face chat. So I think that's a reference to the advisor who's going to read these submissions. And indeed, the advisor did read them, page 22, our page 01663, because the advisor texted Mr. Michel stating that it was his view you'd put up a very strong case which will stand you in good stead on this. The next page, 01664, this time you are sent the email, we're on the 8th of November 2010, which was 4 days after Mr. Cable had issued a European intervention notice. Do you recall that?
Yes. And I'd note that the previous email, I think, is on the day or thereabouts when the European intervention notice was put, saying that our case was strong with respect to our briefing.
The gist of the email 01664, page 23, this is a call with Mr. Cable's main advisor, really along the lines, if I can paraphrase it, that they didn't want a meeting at that stage between News Corps and Mr. Cable. You can see they also wanted to be able to say they took an independent view, or asked me to be in touch regularly in coming weeks, if only to provide him with any evidence materials we would like him to read. And then we can see at the bottom, I also have follow-up calls scheduled with David Lords and Clegg on this. Mr. Cable was taking he said, appropriate line, wasn't he, in terms of not wishing to have a meeting? He wanted to take an independent view. Would you agree?
Well, I think, no. I actually think that it would have been entirely appropriate, and it's the reason that I sought it, to have a meeting with Mr. Cable and his advisors to be able to lay out some of the issues as we saw them, and to be able to lay out both the rationale for the transaction and also our analysis of the relevant plurality and competition concerns. It's self-evident in what emerged over the next 12 months, namely in, I guess it was December when he was removed, but then in interviews that he made afterwards, that he was taking other people's advice, and which is very frustrating, because really, you know, all we wanted to do was be able to sit down in a proper way and say, here are the issues, you, the Secretary of State, should consult on this, and you should be listening to, we know you are going to be listening to and informed by all the different noise around. Please sit us down and let us make our case.
Page 24, 01665, Mr. Michel, to you. Mr. Michel had a meeting with Rupert Harrison, who, I think as we established before lunch, is the special advisor to Mr. George Osborne. Is that right?
That is what you said earlier, yes.
So this was a way into finding out what was going on at a high level, and we can see that from the text of the email. Confirmed tensions in the coalition around Vince Cable and his current policy positions. Vince made a political decision, this is the issue of the European intervention notice, probably without even reading the legal advice, as confirmed to us also by Vicky Price and David Laws yesterday. I mean, do you think it's appropriate, Mr. Murdoch, that here you are getting confidential information as to what's going on at a high level in government?
I think what I was concerned with here was the substance of what was being communicated, not necessarily the channel by which it was being communicated. Mr. Michel's job was to engage with special advisors and at the political level with Westminster, to put it broadly. That is what a public affairs executive does. He reports back what he's being told. And at no point in here did he or the company put forward, anything illegitimate or inappropriate. We just learned. I was concerned here with the substance of what I was hearing. I thought you were about to ask, do you think it's appropriate that he took the decision without reading any of the legal advice?
That speaks for itself, Mr. Murdoch.
And that was the thing and that was the thing that stood out to me in all of these communications. It was the substance of what was being communicated more than reflecting on the channel.
Well, maybe this is your view, and I'm not saying it's right or wrong, that if Mr. Harrison is prepared to speak to Mr. Michel and speak indiscreetly, well, then that's a matter for Mr. Harrison, but Mr. Michel is simply doing his job.
Mr. Michel is reporting back what he's hearing. In some cases, he's calling people, and others, as you just referred to in email, he's receiving telephone calls unprompted. And a channel of communication exists that is just additional to really the important channels, which were the voluminous submissions that we were making to the Secretary of State and to his people and to whomever else who asked for them.
It's also clear from this email that Mr. Salmon was on side as well, but that's consistent with previous email. I'd like to move forward, please, to your page 26, our page 01667.
Yes.
15th of November 2010. Michel, to you. Jeremy, that's Jeremy Hunt, tried to call you. So it looks as if Mr. Hunt was trying to call you, Mr. Murdoch, directly. Is that your understanding?
That seems to be what it says, that Mr. Hunt tried to call me.
He has received very strong legal advice not to meet us today, as the current process is treated as a judicial one, not a policy one, and any meeting could be referred to and jeopardise the entire process. Jeremy is very frustrated about it, but the Permanent Secretary has now also been involved. Well, what did you understand by that?
I understood that there was a meeting scheduled with Mr. Hunt and presumably his advisors, and I certainly was bringing along my public affairs executive, and that it was cancelled because of advice that, as a minister, he shouldn't meet with someone who had an issue before the government.
What was the date on which Mr. Cable's responsibility passed on to Mr. Hunt?
It was a month later.
Sorry?
It's 21st of December.
December,
yes.
Thank you.
And again, Mr. J, I was seeking to have entirely transparent, conversations with policymakers and around the place, because by this point we were obviously extremely frustrated by the things we were hearing. Yeah. I'd also add that a lot of the communications that were coming back from government and from politicians, I took with a grain of salt, given the fact that we had been hearing many, many sides. People were speaking out of different sides of their mouth, it seemed to me, in all the communications that we've come up to.
Well, aside from the point that Mr. Hunt didn't have carriage of the decision, at this stage it was Mr. Cable, what you were being told here was that the government was receiving strong legal advice that as this was a judicial process, meetings were inappropriate. Did you understand that to be the case?
What I understood that was the advice he was getting. It said that he was frustrated, and I was frustrated by it as well, because there was nothing inappropriate, I thought, about being able to advocate a reasonable position, which was that the government should be applying the appropriate legal test, particularly when we had already heard, as we saw in the emails before, that perhaps that wasn't the process that had been followed earlier.
And whatever the position before, Mr. Murdoch, you were being told that as this was a judicial process and not a policy issue, it was inappropriate to have certainly formal meetings and, by parity of reasoning, informal meetings, because that had the propensity to subvert the judicial process. And you must at least have understood that.
And I didn't have any informal meetings. This was, I understood to be that Mr. Hunt would not be taking direct meetings from here on in.
So you understood that it was inappropriate, because this was a judicial process, to have formal meetings with the Secretary of State, did you?
That seems to be what this says. I didn't agree with the points, and I was, and I'm sure I know what you're coming to. I was displeased with the decision.
The email from Mr. Michel continues, my advice would be not to meet him today, as it would be counterproductive for everyone, but you could have a chat with him on his mobile, which is completely fine, and I will liaise with his team privately as well, which suggests, well, if you do it surreptitiously, by direct mobile phone contact, well, then no one will find out about it. That's what this is telling you, isn't it?
I didn't take it to mean surreptitiously. I took it to mean that maybe a small telephone call, he wanted to speak to you, would be fine. But there was no understanding in my mind that a telephone call would replace a meeting that was to be substantive, where we could make the case that we wanted to make. And I'm sure, by the way, there were lots of other things on the agenda to meet with Mr. Hunt on at that time, most notably the IP review, the Hargraves review, next generation access networks legislation, all of the normal things that actually we weren't able to discuss at all because of this this idea that we weren't able to have government meetings.
Did you have a conversation with Mr. Hunt on his mobile phone or otherwise?
I believe he called me to apologize for canceling the meeting, but I don't have a specific recollection, but I think that's what's in the records.
Well, your reply, which is the one reply which may be relevant, timed at 12:02 in the early afternoon. You must be fucking joking. Fine, I will text him and find a time. So you were angry.
As I said earlier, I was displeased.
Did you get advice as to what a judicial process such as this meant, and also what it would be or would not be appropriate for News Corp to be doing in relation to officials and ministers who were responsible for that judicial process?
With respect to a judicial process, my understanding was that the Secretary of State had a responsibility to take into account the advice that he was receiving from his advisors, and that they would receive submissions from various parties in putting that advice forward to him. Our only concern in this, and I think a lot of these communications as we'll keep going, were really around the process itself, because remember, under the Enterprise Act here, this was uncharted territory. We hadn't really done this before with the Secretary of State doing this. And so the timetables, how many submissions, what other bodies would be consulted and what wouldn't be consulted at different phases in it, was something that was, a matter of dialogue with the relevant authorities as we went through it.
Yes.
And that, which is why, again, which is what a public affairs executive does, is try to have an understanding of those things and keep the process moving along.
The next few pages, starting at 01668, show that Mr. Michel was also trying to work on the special advisor for Mr. Cable, and Mr. Wilkes, who was Mr. Cable's special advisor, was saying that would be inappropriate.
Are you on pages 27 and 28?
Yes. He refers, for example, to his being sure that we're both equally interested in staying within the bounds of proper conduct. So he's warning Mr. Michel to lay off, isn't he?
But I think, listen, I can't speculate. I wasn't on any of these emails.
No.
But actually what we've seen, given the process that the Department for Business Innovation and Skills had gone through, they didn't want any dialogue, and they didn't want to have anyone talking to them about the process because they hadn't had one.
Okay. Page 31, 01672.
I think the proper reading of this email requires you to look at the one at the bottom. Mr. Michel is saying to Mr. Wilkes, well, so that means nobody else has spoken, you've not met anybody else, and asking somewhat pointedly, and he's responding, well, it happens, I don't think I have. And of course we've got to stay in proper conduct, and then the top one says, well, I understand, I was only being cheeky in a friendly way.
And he does back off.
Well, you weren't copied into those emails. The next email that was sent to you is in the early evening of the 15th of November, page 01672, your page 31, when Mr. Michel tells you he just had a conversation with Vince's main advisor regarding meetings they might have had with the complainants to the transaction, given rumours we hear.
That he might have had a meeting. I'm sorry, where are you in this? I apologize, Mr. Chairman.
Page 31.
I have the page, I'm just not reading
I just read out the first sentence.
Yeah. I
think at one stage, I'm not sure exactly when, that there was a meeting between Mr. Cable and the complainants to the transaction, wasn't there?
We understand that to be the case, but they're saying it didn't happen here.
Yeah.
This group of people, I don't think the FT, although they were sort of outside it, had very publicly come together. I think they called themselves an alliance. I think they capitalized it. And they had a PR firm and a legal firm, Slaughter and May, that was doing, a lot of lobbying on the other side.
And on the 17th of November, it's not within these emails, you gave a speech at Barcelona. Do you remember that?
It was a presentation at an investor conference.
You appreciate that presentation was interpreted by some as a threat to government over a reference to the Competition Commission, wasn't it?
I think it was miscast as that in the UK press. At the time, the initial wire stories and things like that, and I've gone back and looked at it, actually played it pretty straight. It was simply, an argument about the economic benefits and an argument about potential disincentives to invest around lengthy and uncertain regulatory processes.
It wasn't a gentle message to government to get on with it, was it?
It was a clear message to say that uncertain and lengthy regulatory processes were a disincentive to invest, and they made it harder for businesses who have a lot of choices to invest around the world, particularly News Corporation, to to make decisions to invest in those areas where that uncertainty existed. I think any business person would agree with that, and anyone would think it entirely reasonable to advocate that position.
Page 32, 01673. Email Mr. Michel to you, 19th of November. Lord Oakeshott was told today by Cable's advisor to approach any meeting with Lord Oakeshott as a proxy for Vince Cable, an intro discussion on the substance of Rubicon. Is Rubicon the internal company name for the acquisition of the remaining shares?
Yeah, it was just a project code name on internal documents.
And the possible way forward. The next email, I will have a session with Hunt's advisor next Wednesday to update on Ofcom process and next steps. Why was there continual interaction with Mr. Hunt at this stage when he didn't have responsibility for deciding the bid?
I think the view was that we wanted any interested party in policymaking to be able to see the relevant arguments and the relevant submissions, given that we were concerned about the process and we wanted to make sure that the relevant process, the right process, and the relevant legal tests were applied. So we were happy to provide documents, arguments, official copies of submissions, etc., if ministers' advisors wanted them.
The email continues, Jeremy has also asked me to send him relevant documents privately. Do you know which documents those were?
I would imagine it was things like submissions, things that were the official documents, just so he could have them. But I'm speculating.
Do you know whether that happened?
I don't. I think so, because I think in reading all of these just the other day, that there are some times when they say, oh, they've read them, but I don't know if that's his advisors or who.
Now move forward to your page 36, our page 01677. Mr. Michel reporting back to you, 2nd December 2010. Michel has spoken to the advisors of both the Deputy Prime Minister and the Prime Minister. Do you see that?
Yes.
Particularly the emboldened bullet point. message coming from the Deputy Prime Minister's advisor, honest discussion on the importance for us of getting Labour on board, comfortable with the transaction as they will influence cable a lot. Well, that again is demonstrating the importance of the political dimension, isn't it?
Which they were telling us to focus on.
Can you look please at page 38, 01679, 14th of December. I think in order to understand this, I have to leave into the chronology. The 10th of December 2010, Ofcom published its issues letter identifying the key issues which would need to be addressed in relation to the merger. We know that from another exhibit, KRM 17, but we're not going to look at it. Now, the right order for reading these emails, can you look at the email first, at the second email on page 38, 01679, because that comes first in time.
Yes.
That's Michelle to you. Very good debrief with Hunt on the issues letter. He's pretty amazed by its findings, methodology and clear bias. He very much shares our views on it. We're going to try to find a way for you to meet with him one-to-one before Christmas. Because we don't know whether that reference to Mr. Hunt is to Mr. Hunt in person or his special advisor, do we?
Or Hunt's office in general, yeah, we don't.
Can I ask you this general question, Mr. Murdoch? When you were getting these emails through, did you interpret all the references to Mr. Hunt as to him personally, or did you interpret them more widely as being a reference to his advisor or to his office?
I think it had assumed that he was communicating through his office. I would have assumed, I think the minister's busy at events, doing things, all the other things that a minister has to do, so I didn't assume that it was all direct.
Okay, the next
But I think you can appreciate just, I mean, again, you know, the channel wasn't of my primary concern here. It was the content of these notes, which were confirming our concerns, or at least providing, at least other people seem to agree with our concerns about the process.
Although this time the issues letter emanates from Ofcom, it doesn't have anything to do with government, does it?
Well, I believe it's an issues letter that's issued by Ofcom in response to the intervention notice that the Secretary of State had made a little while before. The issues letter identifies issues, and then it comes out, and then people opine, and then Ofcom publishes a more formal report later on, and that didn't come until the end of December. The issues letter is part of the same process and gives interested parties an idea of what sort of things they're going to be weighing up and thinking about. Yes. In terms of how they determine what to do.
Well, I think its title is self-explanatory. We understand its purpose. But if you read through the email chain going upwards, Mr. Michel, pardon me, it's Rebecca Brooks.
I think Mr. Michel is.
Yes.
It's Mr. Michel forwarding or adding an email to an email that is sent, isn't it?
I think it might be a separate one. I'm not sure it matters much. But it's Rebecca Brooks, 3 minutes later, sending an email to you and to Mr. Michel. It's clear that Rebecca Brooks has spoken to either George Osborne or his office. The message is total, same from GO, total bafflement at response. So you're also getting insight into what Mr. Osborne thinks about the issues letter, aren't you?
Well, it may not have been the issues letter in particular. I mean, remember, there was a general bafflement at Ofcom's view because most people had assumed that we had controlled Sky already.
Well, Mr. Osborne's list of meetings with proprietors, this conversation with Mrs. Brooks is described as a general discussion, but maybe we can consider that. Higher up the page, Mr. Michel is emailing you and Mrs. Brooks, referring to feedback from a spokesman close to Mr. Cable. And I think the feedback we learn at page 39, 01680, when you're told that Mr. Michel has just spoken to Vince's main advisor. Neither date I put forward with a meeting with Vince early January is likely to work. Vince is out of the country. And so there's a possibility of a meeting in mid-January. Do you see that?
But again, I mean, I took a lot of the communication coming from the politicians with a big grain of salt, because they had been, this is now 6 months into this process. We hadn't been able to get a meeting with the relevant advisor. We'd heard conflicting accounts of whether or not he was willing to look at evidence or not willing to look at evidence. We had an issues letter from Ofcom that was, hard to understand where they were going. So the whole thing at this point was very frustrating.
Next page, page 40, 01681. Mr. Michel, to you. He just had a chat with Clegg's Chief of Staff regarding the ongoing process. He was very surprised when I pointed out to him that Cable will be tempted to take a decision with a lot of political influence. For him, the referral is not a matter for Lib Dems, it's a matter for the Secretary of State in accordance with his statutory obligations. Well, as it happens, that's 100% correct. Said he was unclear, therefore, why News Corps is seeking out the views of people who have no locus in the decision-making process and thinking that their views indicate that the decision will be political. Why were you doing that?
Well, because Vince's main advisor, many months before, had advised us to do so.
I can paraphrase the rest, that Mr. Cable was keen to make up his own mind and not be influenced by anyone, although you were trying to influence him, weren't you?
We were simply trying to make the case that a clear process should be put in place around this, and that a relevant legal test that's clearly understood should be applied. I don't think that's influencing. That's saying, let us make the side of the argument one way or another, so that he can see, so that he can have the right inputs to make a decision.
Okay. Page 41, 01682. We're now the early evening of the 21st of December 2010, and Mr. Cable's remarks to the two persons posing as his members of his constituency, but in fact journalists, had entered the public domain. It's clear that Mr. Michel had spoken to either Mr. Clegg's Chief of Staff or his special advisor. Just spoke. He is absolutely furious. That's Mr. Clegg who is absolutely furious, or his advisor is, it doesn't matter which. Said Cable's comments unacceptable. I ran through roll of Telegraph. Cable about to be blackmailed. Do you know what that was about?
Blackmailed? I didn't. Oh, I think it's because when the comments came out, they had been they came out on well, I guess it was on TV, but also Mr. Peston's for the BBC's blog came out, and apparently the Telegraph, who had done the recording around a number of Liberal Democrats at that time, had gotten this recording and then had published it as the full transcript, but without the relevant piece about News Corporation. I think Mr. Cable said something like, they're under attack from everywhere, and I've declared war on Mr. Murdoch, and he'll stop the B-Sky B transaction. And importantly, he says that that's the reason why it's good to be in coalition government because they can do things like this as opposed to just protesting in opposition. I'm paraphrasing there. That was what he said. That whole piece was left out of the Telegraph, and given their prominent role in the so-called alliance against this, that was cause for some, concern of ours, and we thought it was pretty inappropriate. And then the demands by Oakeshott, when I did meet with Lord Oakeshott, ahead of any Ofcom piece or whatever it is, there were suggestions made of divesting the Times and other things like that, that I just wouldn't engage in because I thought that only the relevant legal test should be the matter at hand.
Well, the reference, though, to Mr. Clegg's office being furious, Mr. Cable's comments being unacceptable, that must, though, be a reference to Mr. Cable's remark that he wanted to declare war on Murdoch,
or that he had.
Yeah,
I think it was an exposure of acute bias, as I mentioned earlier.
Okay. Page 42, 01683. We're now Christmas Eve. Mr. Michel emailing you and others. Mr. Michel says he just spoke to JH, who claims to have spoken, I think, to Mr. Hunt directly. This is the last of the communications, which is with Mr. Hunt directly, according to Mr. Michel's witness statement. Said he was very happy for me to be the point of contact with him, Adam. Well, Adam is the special advisor of Mr. Hunt. On behalf of JRM going forward, very important to avoid giving the ante any opportunity to attack the fairness of the process and find to liaise at that political level, while also DCMS, NWS legal teams are in touch. So, to be clear, by this stage, Mr. Hunt had now been seized with responsibility for making the quasi-judicial decision, hadn't he?
And that's right. And my understanding is that we had sought to understand what the right way to liaise with DCMS was, now that the responsibility had passed to them, and it appears that this was DCMS's answer.
Yes. So the answer seems to be, well, there can't be direct contact, Mr. Hunt and Mr. Murdoch, but there can be indirect contact through Mr. Michel and Mr. Hunt's special advisor, Mr. Adam Smith. That's right, isn't it?
Well, I think it's direct contact between Mr. Smith and Mr. Michel. I read it to be nothing inappropriate there, but actually just to say that people's advisors and their staff would coordinate and communicate throughout the process.
I'm not quite sure that's what this is saying. What Mr. Michel is saying, it's very important to avoid giving the ante any opportunity to attack the fairness of the process. So he's saying that if there were direct contact, Mr. Murdoch and Mr. Hunt, that would give the ante an opportunity to attack the fairness of the process, and I would add in brackets correctly. But if we do it on the level of political advisor and Mr. Michel, well then that risk is reduced.
But Mr. Hunt in January did meet with me and with all of his advisors, and those are the minuted meetings you referred to earlier, and that there was a formal meeting process where we could make our case, and which is what we always sought. I understand he also took meetings with other constituents in this whole piece, the deal and so on and so forth, but that coordination coordination by staff was a normal part of making sure that process moved along.
Well, Mr. Hunt must have taken the view on advice that formal meetings, and we've seen the minutes of those meetings, 6th of January and 20th January 2011, were okay. That would not impugn the fairness of the process. But if there is informal contact of the sort we're seeing here, that would be inappropriate. And the way to avoid the appearance of that is let the informal contact take place secretly between Mr. Michel and the special advisor. Do you see that point?
Mr. Jay, respectfully, I disagree with that point. I think he was saying that informal contact between me and Mr. Hunt or others would raise eyebrows, because they would say what was discussed, etc. But general contact at the political level, if you will, and at the staff level, around process, around document submissions, around just to give color around these things from us, that was something that was acceptable, and that was part of the process he was setting up.
Well, it may depend on what the contact is about. Would you agree?
I suppose so, and as we go through, I assume we're going to keep going through this.
We're going to keep going. We'll see the sort of contacts which took place as the months ensued, and we might begin to see whether they fell into the appropriate box or the inappropriate box. Let's look at the next one. New Year's Eve, page 43, 01684. You're not party to this one. Jeremy Hunt and his team have not received it yet. The it, you just bear with me, was the Ofcom report on the bid, which was published that day. We'll let you know if they do today. We already know privately Jeremy will not look at it before next Wednesday, not to be repeated. So, what did you deduce from that?
I didn't really. I mean, I just deduced from this whole piece that Ofcom were keeping us informed, and Mr. Hunt's office was in a dialogue, and we were waiting for this report to be released so that we could digest it and understand what the issues may be. And I think earlier on it said that Mr. Hunt was away or something like that, so it probably was just that he's away and he's not going to read it right away.
I'll move forward to page 46, 01687. Mr. Michel spoke to Hunt. Well, according to Mr. Michel's statement, we must read that as Hunt's office or Hunt's advisor, more likely, and not Mr. Hunt directly. But you're getting an insight here into Mr. Hunt's current thinking. He is relaxed, re Guardian FT piece tomorrow, amazed by Watson sending the confidential email to Guardian. Well, that I think related to phone hacking issues, but and Reuters, and hopes Whittingdale will launch inquiry into it. He said Weber Shandwick was still doing the session with CMS committee Thursday, and we shall not tell anyone. And then a little bit later on, he understands, that's Hunt understands,
Mr. Jay, sorry, it says in that we should tell everyone.
What did I say?
The opposite.
Pardon me. He understands the cost of a CC referral and the potential damage for the bid. So this is Hunt's, Mr. Hunt's, pardon me, insight as to the current state of affairs, which you are receiving directly from his special advisor, aren't you?
As I understand it, that this is the feedback that we heard. And I think the important thing here is to look at, Weber Shandwick, remember, is working for the parties against the Associated Newspapers, British Telecom, who else was in there? The BBC was at first, and then they came out. The Guardian was in there. That group of complainants. And what they were doing talking to the CMS committee about it, I don't know, but they were the PR firm advising on plurality on the proposal that we were making. And I think it's important to note as well that there was lots of selective leaking going on around this time and through the spring around also a Slaughters and May opinion that had been commissioned around the issue of plurality. So we were dealing with incomplete information, and we didn't actually we didn't know what information other people had seen, but we were told that they were seeing quite a lot.
Right. But you're also being given confidential information here as to Mr. Hunt's discussions with Mr. Ed Richards of Ofcom, because towards the bottom of the email we see that that's Mr. Hunt, challenged Ed on the maybe rationale. Ed was adamant that the threshold was very low and referral was the only option. He also challenged him on sufficiency of plurality. Ed repeated the same concerns which are in the report. I mean, did you think it was appropriate that you were receiving insights into private conversations between Ofcom and the Secretary of State?
Well, I'm not sure how accurate they were anyway. As I told you before, Mr. J, all of this was taken with a grain of salt, given what we were going through. And in the event, Mr. Hunt took every single word of Ofcom's advice all the way up until we withdrew the transaction. So it doesn't really, this may have just been coming from his advisor, coloring it, trying to make nice, while behind the scenes, they were just going to follow everything that Ofcom and the OFT said, which is in the event exactly what happened.
I think you're making the point that one can't necessarily trust the accuracy of what appears here, but you didn't know that at the time, did you?
No, but as I said, I had taken all of it with a grain of salt because, again, we were dealing with politicians and, we'd seen in the early emails that they'll spin one way and then the next, trying to, just have the conversation. And Mr. Michel, who's a public affairs executive, his job is to, have that conversation and listen and then come back.
If you look at pages 48 and 49, our pages 01689 and 01690, you see an example of a different sort of email which Mr. Smith sent to Mr. Michel. It's a much more formal email, isn't it? Mm-hmm. The sort of email which could appropriately be sent and received, rather than the informal, gossipy and perhaps inappropriate emails we were looking at previously. Do you notice the difference in the tone?
Well, I think this is a formal letter about the process, which is something that we would have. I mean, again, most of these emails in here, and as we continue to go through them, are really about the process and our concern that the appropriate things were being considered, that they were being considered in the appropriate way, and that our legal arguments were heard, around the place. I mean, this is a large-scale transaction that was in the hands, with respect to the decision-making process, of the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. We're going to get into in a minute the undertakings in lieu that were extracted, the concession, or the remedy, if you will. And it was entirely reasonable to try to communicate with the relevant policymakers about the merits of what we were proposing.
Although you weren't sent this email, we can see at page 51, 01692, an example of a rather different email where Mr. Michel is reporting back on discussions he had with Mr. Hunt's special advisor as to what was going to happen next. And you're given detail here, confidential basis of timetables, and indeed Mr. Hunt's view of the merits of your case. If you look at the middle of the page, it says his view, that's Mr. Hunt's view, is that once he announces publicly he has a strong UIL, and that's reference to the undertakings, it's almost game over for the opposition.
Well, it was already game over once we offered it because they had won. We basically said to them, irrespective of the merits of the plurality conclusion, we will just take plurality off the table by removing Sky News, the main issue, the only change in plurality that could possibly or conceivably be come from this transaction. The undertaking in lieu had removed it because it removed Sky News from the transaction entirely. Sky News was spun as a separate entity. It would have no change to its ownership structure. So Mr. Hunt was trying to say, no, he's being helpful, but actually by this point he had already extracted a structural solution that was very, very robust and on the face of it dealt with the problem.
Yes, but Mr. Hunt was still acting in a quasi-judicial role. He still hadn't granted you the bid, as it were, and he's letting you know what his view is. It's almost game over for the opposition. You understand that, don't you?
Yes, because the undertaking was strong, and I would have thought that the opposition actually, we would have won the arguments with the opposition from there because they had gotten what they professed to want.
I'm not sure you understand the difference, Mr. Murdoch. Even if you think you had a 99% rock-solid case, there's a difference between you having that view and then the judge who's going to decide the case telling you behind the scenes that it's the judge's view as well that you're going to win. Don't you see the difference between the two?
I guess the primary case that I was concerned with here was whether or not an undertaking would be required at all. Given the strength of the undertaking we required, I saw that as largely the end of the process, and now this was really just about negotiating some of the details around the undertaking going forward.
If you look what else
the game had been over because the undertaking had been extracted, and it was so strong.
I'm not sure that begins to answer my question. Your answers systematically on the basis is News Corp's case was a brilliant case. Now, I'm saying let's accept that as a given, but there's a difference between you thinking you had a brilliant case and the judge telling you that you had a brilliant case. And that's what you're being told through this email, aren't you?
I think there are two cases here, Mr. J, respectfully.
Is the answer yes or no, Mr. Murdoch?
No, it's... Mr. J, I apologize, but may I? I think there are two cases here.
Okay.
There was a case which was really about whether or not there was insufficiency of plurality with respect to this transaction completing. And I did think that we had a strong case, and I still believe it was a strong case.
Yeah.
That case was lost, essentially, when Ofcom wrote its report, which I thought, had lots of flaws, and we submitted lots of work on that and went through it. And ultimately, we conceded that we would not be able to win that argument, and the case was lost. At this point, we enter a new case, right? And the only case really is how to negotiate the undertakings in lieu and those pieces that was just starting. And the undertakings, they were very strong undertakings. They structurally separated the company.
We understand that. This is the third time you've told us that. I understood it the first time, and I understand it this time. But all you're doing is telling me how good your case was. But my point is that you were learning that the judge also thought it was a good case.
And again,
weren't you?
But I would say I took all of that with a grain of salt because I thought it may have just been his office saying, oh, look, it'll be fine. But actually, all the way through this, there was never any inch of, he only just took the advice of the OFT and Ofcom at every turn.
But look what we see a bit later on, which may resonate with at least part of the truth, if not all of it. He understands fully our concerns, fears regarding the publication of the report and the consultation of Ofcom in the process, but he wants us to take the heat with him in the next 2 weeks. So the political heat he wants to be shared. He said very specifically that he was keen to get to the same outcome and wanted JRM to understand he needs to build some political cover on the process.
Which I took to mean basically he didn't want to take any heat alone. I had never met a politician who did. And he was about to go and do something that we wouldn't like, and he wanted us just to be quiet about it while he went out and consulted on the undertaking.
Yes, but you got some solace, though. He said he would get there at the end, and he shared our objectives.
Which,
Pardon me?
all of these things from politicians you take with a grain of salt.
Yeah, but if it weren't for the public relations disaster of the Guardian piece on the 5th of July 2011, you would have got the remaining shares, wouldn't you?
I can't speculate. He never ended up making that decision.
Well, Mr. Murdoch, you've read these emails, I'm sure as closely as I have, that the wind by that point was blowing very firmly in your direction, wasn't it?
Well, I think the legal test had been examined, and the undertaking in lieu was strong enough, and I had high hopes that we would be able to proceed with the transaction.
And then Mr. Hunt as well, or his office, page 52, 01693. It's Mr. Michel to you. Subject, confidential. I had a very constructive conversation with JH tonight. Please read all the below. He's keen to look at the UIL tomorrow, Tuesday, and confirm we would have a meeting with him on the business plan later in the week. I read on. He will, as he confirmed yesterday, go ahead Tuesday with the publication of the Ofcom report, our submission, and announce he's looking at UIL. He did not say that he's minded to accept he will not say he's minded to accept in the statement. So the statement is the public statement, isn't it?
I assume so.
He's keen to see our legal letter on process early tomorrow morning. I have run through it, and he recognises the strength of our arguments, especially on consulting Ofcom and Ofcom report publication. So your letter on process, before he receives it, is transmitted to him, or the gist of it is transmitted to Mr. Hunt's advisor in advance, isn't it?
Well, I think just in terms of updating them and say this is where we are, this is the letter we're putting together, is that helpful or not? I mean, I think it's just a staff conversation, as I understand it, about process. And again, because the undertaking was, again, we were sort of in new territory in terms of timetables, in terms of who Mr. Hunt had to consult with, how to run those consultations, etc. Process was really top of our mind.
Nevertheless, he thinks that the publication of Ofcom report, although a departure from the Sky ITV process, does help to buy in some time politically and provide some content to the public debate. And then a bit later on, he's keen for me to work with his team on the statement during the course of tomorrow and offer some possible language. That's really good news. So the public statement that Mr. Hunt is going to put out is one which is going to be a collaborative effort between Mr. Hunt's team and your team, isn't it?
I think it's not necessarily about the statement by Mr. Hunt. It seems to me about a statement by News Corporation, that they were trying to influence us in the statement. That's my reading of that. He's keen for me to work with his team on the statement during the course of tomorrow and offer some possible language.
I do think it's Mr.
Perhaps I'm wrong. That was the way I read it when I went through these emails.
Didn't you feel by this point that, in effect, although this was going to take some time, this deal was in the bag with this Secretary of State?
I didn't actually. I was very worried about this transaction because while we had done as much as we could do, it just seemed to be interminable. And the more consultations went on and the longer the process lasted, the more I was concerned. The whole point of the undertaking was to avoid the 32 weeks, or if not more, of the Competition Commission process. So as it took longer and longer, the value of that diminished, and it was becoming difficult for us.
It does look, if you look towards the bottom of the email, you see the paragraph beginning "for the statement."
Yeah, no,
Tuesday.
I've just seen that.
It does look as if that's Mr. Hunt's statement and not.
It may be. Whether or not it's the same statement, I just don't know. Again, it was a while ago.
And then look at the email at page 54, 01695, in the middle of the page, 24th January, Mr. Michel to you. Confidential JH statement. Managed to get some infos on the plans for tomorrow. Brackets, although absolutely illegal. What do you make of that?
I thought it was a joke. I mean, I think the greater than and the exclamation point there are a wink. It's a joke.
Is it? It was absolutely illegal in one sense. It was completely unethical, wasn't it?
I'm not so sure. I mean, look, Mr. J, I'm really not, I have to say, I'm not familiar with the sort of ins and outs of Westminster Protocol, and I know that the rules around lobbying and all of those bits and pieces are of some of some debate. and it's really not my profession, but it seemed to me, and again, as I was going through these, my fundamental concern was that a process was sound and that the appropriate things were being considered and that it wasn't becoming politicized. And I think in the context of everything we've seen today in this evidence, that was a very legitimate concern that the company had. And our representatives sought to gain as much information as they could and have a dialogue in the right way to try to find out how things were going.
A sneak preview of the Secretary of State press statement and statement to Parliament, wasn't it? And you were given the gist of it here. We can read it for ourselves in this email, can't we?
Well, in the dialogue from the first a few pages ago, yes, this was the question of the process going forward, and they outlined to us, this is the timetable, on Tuesday it will be this, and on Thursday it will be that, and that's how this process will work. So that both sides could prepare. I understand it's, I've looked into this, or I've been told anyway more recently, that in a judgment, for example, it's sometimes customary for the two sides to get an advance warning of how a process is going to work or how it's going to go, so they can prepare.
It's not quite the analogy here, that when the judge gives his or her decision, it is submitted in draft to the parties confidentially a few days beforehand, so that typographical errors, if any, can be pointed out. Of course, the judge has reached a decision without covert submissions from either party. But the reason why it's a poor analogy is that this judge, arguably, I'll put it as low as I can, was in contact through his special advisor with Mr. Michel directly. So you were having covert interactions with him, weren't you?
I never saw them as necessarily covert, and I would have expected that his advisors were communicating with other parties around this transaction as well. It was a hotly contested and very high-profile transaction, and there was quite a lot going on. I mentioned before certain briefing notes being leaked, briefings being given to the press selectively. These things were very, very difficult to cope with, and I assumed that Mr. Hunt's office, as the center of it, was trying to coordinate, trying to have a discussion with all of the relevant parties as well as agencies, so that it could be kept in line and move the thing along.
Is it your evidence then that you assume that Mr. Hunt's office was having the same sort of surreptitious conversation with the Alliance Against News Corp?
I haven't seen that evidence, but I assume that conversations were going on.
There's another insight into Mr. Hunt's private thinking, assuming that the special advisor is correctly communicating it. Page 63, 01704. JH just said there was plenty of support for the remedy in the statement, potential to mitigate problems. He can't say they are too brilliant, otherwise people will call for them to be published. You see that?
I do see it, yes.
But it's obvious what's going on here, isn't it? He's giving you a nod and a wink.
I don't think he is. I think he's trying to. I think their office is trying to cover themselves because they don't know what their decision is going to be. They have a decision. They have a decision to be made, and at every part in this process, they followed the advice of Ofcom and the OFT, and it was for us really to negotiate. And I think it's crucial. You mentioned earlier in the sort of preamble to this evidence to take into account the enormous amount of documentary submissions, official legal backs and forths in the negotiation with both the OFT and Ofcom and DCMS at this time. So this is really just a sort of a side of that where they're saying, no, it's not as bad as you think, when we were asserting that actually there were problems.
Page 66, 01707.
Which page, sorry, Mr. J?
66 in your version. Just had an update on today's events with JH. We seem to have been able to weaken most of the arguments of the complainants and Labour and expose Ofcom's very political, biased approach towards the bid and its rationale. Undertakings mentioned include independent board and complete sale of Sky News, which is not unhelpful. Given the opposition has very few arguments on the impact of media plurality, they decided to focus on the process and political bias. And then at the end, JH believes we're in a good place tonight.
Well, again, I think
you're being given private information about the Secretary of State's current view, aren't you?
Just looking at the... Listen, I think I don't know, it's a private view. I think they're just saying, calm down. It's still, we're still, if we were upset about this, given what else was going on out there, and I can't remember exactly the sequence, what was confidential and what wasn't at this point with respect to the undertaking and the details around it, because there were some commercial issues around it, that this was a question of this debate now being very public and arguments being made by others. And hopefully, we were doing a reasonable job to, defend the undertaking that the Secretary of State was consulting on.
We move forward to page 71, and we're not going to cover all these emails. 01712, Mr. Michel, to you, 4th of February. Confidential. JH, please read. Why do you think Mr. Michel is putting confidential on all these emails?
I sort of think it was customary in a lot of these, any sort of a transaction like this or whatever it is, that pretty much everything I would think was marked confidential if it could be. But I don't think there's anything that notable about it. Certainly in my experience in business in general, lots of things, are commercially sensitive or what have you.
Well, according to this, Mr. Hunt's view was he feels overall the process is in a good place. The media attention on the remedy has disappeared. DCMS officials have been very clear with OFT and Ofcom today that Ofcom has to respect its remit. He's fully aware of the 9 questions. Those are the questions sent by OFT to News Corps on the 1st of February. We have worries on and completely agree with our fears given the toxic relationship and mistrust of Ofcom. He's received enormous pressure from Enders and Slaughter May to take into consideration their evidence. And then a bit later on, I'm trying to get the documents, but it might be difficult. So Mr. Michel, on your behalf, is trying to get documents which aren't yet in the public domain, isn't he?
Well, I think this refers to what I was talking about before with respect to briefings and submissions being made by and conversations being had with, in terms of pressure here, for example, from Enders and Slaughters and May, which I think is more than just documents, it's pressure, which is on the other side of this. And then what we wanted to do is we really wanted to see Slaughters and May's arguments, but I don't think we ever managed to. They were leaked selectively to the press at various times. But I don't recall ever actually seeing them, but we asked people if they would share them with us, and I don't think anybody did.
So you don't believe that Mr. Michael was successful in obtaining these documents from the Secretary of State's team, is that right?
I don't recall, and from anywhere, I should say, from press, etc., where we asked. And I think if you look again, this goes, this email really, again, is about the process here. And the understanding of our frustrations, but it also goes on to really describe the political pressure and the heat, it says, from the Mail, the Guardian, the Independent, the Telegraph, once the UIL is known, and so on and so forth. So it really speaks, I think, to that relationship between the pressure that the other newspapers were putting on Mr. Hunt, presumably through coverage, etc., to pursue, a commercial objection to this transaction.
Page 76, 01717. Michel, to you, 7:24 in the evening, confidential. As agreed on the call, that must have been a previous conversation you had with Mr. Michel, is that correct?
I don't remember.
I've managed to get JH quickly before he went in to see Swan Lake and have further chat. Well, we may have to discover in due course whether it was JH who went to see Swan Lake or Mr. Adam Smith who went to see Swan Lake. I don't know how did you interpret this at the time?
Again, I thought that the conversations were going through the staff level, and I think when you interweave, and I've been told I haven't been through it in great detail, some of the text messages and other things that are in touch between Mr. Smith and Mr. Michel, it would support that I think Mr. Smith, and I shouldn't speculate, I think Mr. Smith and Mr. Hunt were at Swan Lake together.
Okay. It answers that. But as with previous emails, I'm not sure I'm going to dwell on the detail. You're being given further insights as to Mr. Hunt's then current view, aren't you?
This is about feedback around the negotiation with various parties, the OFT and Ofcom, on the undertaking, which was a lengthy negotiating process. I mean, we're now in almost the middle of February.
Page 78, 01719. Michelle, to you. I met with Alex Salmon's advisor today. He will call Hunt whenever we need him to. Well, what do you think that was about?
Well, I think it was previously when I had went and seen Mr. Salmon to talk about some of the economic benefits, and I ran him through the plurality arguments if he was asked. He had offered to be supportive as a Scottish politician and leader. Now the responsibility had shifted to Mr. Hunt. We were in an undertakings phase. Those economic arguments still stood. And if you see previously in other places, Mr. Hunt's advisors and others suggest that we should try to find allies, people who can advocate who aren't just us talking our book. And Mr. Salmon had already said that, you know, he thought that this might be a good transaction for Scotland.
Well, it's supposed to be a personal and quasi-judicial decision made by the Secretary of State alone, isn't it?
As we were told by Mr. Cable's advisors as well as Mr. Hunt's, having an atmosphere of more support around this transaction would be helpful to them for their own political purposes.
Look at point 1. He noticed a major change in the Sun's coverage recently. That's the Sun in Scotland, isn't it?
That is the Scottish Sun, yeah, because he's talking about the Daily Record there as well.
The major change was that the Sun in Scotland was being supportive of him, wasn't it?
I'm not sure at that time, but Mr. Salmon always talked about the way he was covered in the newspapers, particularly the Scottish Sun. And he had a relationship with Mr. Dinsmore, the editor there, that was ongoing.
But doesn't this give rise to at least the perception, put at its lowest, that the favourable coverage of Mr. Salmon in the Scottish Sun means that Mr. Salmon is more willing and more likely to want to call Mr. Hunt, quotes, whenever we need him to?
Now, if the insinuation is that there was any quid pro quo with editorial coverage versus a commercial agenda, I can tell you categorically that it's false. And there's no connection. As we discussed earlier in the section more broadly around politicians, you know, politicians seek the favor of the press at all times. And I don't think I've had a conversation with Mr. Salmon or others where it didn't come up. Either complaining about how they were covered or saying, you know, that they liked so-and-so. So this is always something that was on their agenda. And there was no way to avoid it.
And to be clear, Mr. Murdoch, is it your evidence to us that there wasn't a deliberate policy at News Corps that News International's Scottish paper, The Sun, would improve its coverage of Mr. Salmon with the expected quid pro quo that Mr. Salmon would then call Mr. Hunt whenever we needed him to?
That was absolutely not News Corporation's policy, and I wouldn't do business like that.
Point 2. He believes the time has come to organise a first ministerial debate between him and Ian Gray, the Labour leader, who are the two only possible FM, that's First Minister candidates. He would be very keen for Sky News to organise it with Adam. Is that Adam Bolton of Sky News?
I don't know. It could be. I just don't know. But Sky News, as you know, had been a driving force behind the organisation of the debates the previous year, and Mr. Salmon always raised it with me and with Sky and with everyone that he thought they should have Scottish debates and we should put them on Sky News. This was a standing agenda item for him. And I believe they did eventually.
All right, I think that's a convenient moment to have a break. We've had an hour and a quarter. We'll
Mr. Murdoch, there are about 80 emails to go, but I have decided to, editorially, if you like, to reduce this because they're very much along similar lines. We're just going to pick up some key ones, if you don't mind.
Okay.
But the flavour, if that's the right word, doesn't vary much. Page 79, 01720. Mr. Michel, to you. Here he's giving you a preview, pardon me, about Ofcom and OFT and what their recommendations will be and why. JH called, he now knows what Ofcom and OFT will send him tonight. Both will recommend he refer to the Competition Commission. Ofcom, there's concern on the non-executive chairman. OFT, concern on acquisition of shares. JH doesn't want this to go to the CC. He also said his officials don't want this to go further, as JH believes it would kill the deal. He also knows that Ofcom is taking a very subjective and non-legal approach on the chairman issue and understands the very serious personal nature of it for us. You must have been very pleased to receive confidential information of this sort in advance of its formal publication, Mr. Murdoch. Is that right?
No, because the information was awful. It was saying that the advice of Ofcom and the OFT would be to refer the deal to the CC even after the undertaking was negotiated, and that the remaining issues there, we were going to have to cave on if we wanted to avoid referral.
Aside from the substance, and I understand what you say about the substance, the fact that you were being given an insight ahead of time into what the regulators were saying was of interest and value to you, wasn't it?
It wasn't really of value. It was just from the standpoint of the process and to be able to think about it and prepare. I guess that's good, but the substance was the important piece, and at no point in this process was the substance anything other than the Secretary of State following the advice of the OFT and Ofcom.
We know that it was Mr. Hunt's belief that a referral to the CC would kill the deal. That, I don't believe, was News Corp's position, was it?
I don't think we had made a firm decision, but it would materially risked it. It was the problem with the referral to the CC, which was that it extended the period that much further, potentially another 32 weeks, and we're already now in the middle of February. And it's incredibly inefficient for us, for the company, to be waiting on what appeared to be an indefinite process, actually, with uncertain outcomes with respect to the amount of cash that it required to keep us to keep on our balance sheet, which doesn't earn much money. We were under quite a lot of pressure at the time as well to invest that money in other ways, either buying back our own shares or other things, mostly buying back our own shares. And investors were restive on the subject of the use of capital. And any delay in this transaction had real costs and also, increased that pressure.
You'd certainly want Mr. Hunt to believe that delay would kill the deal, wouldn't you?
Well, I wanted him to understand the parameters of the decisions that he was taking, given the fact that, that there were consequences.
Well, I think the answer is yes, isn't it, Mr. Murdoch?
Yes, I'd want him to understand that.
Okay, I'm moving on, if you don't mind. There are individual points on individual emails, but in the end, it's the overall impression. Page 100, our page 01741. Alex Salmon called. He had a very good dinner with the editor of The Sun in Scotland yesterday. The Sun is now keen to back the SNP at the election. The editor will make his pitch to the editorial team tomorrow. Alex wanted to see whether he could help smooth the way for the process. What did you make of that?
Not much. I mean, I think, as I mentioned before, he had a relationship with the editor of The Sun in Scotland. I would just point out that, I don't know why Mr. Salmon would have to tell Fred, and Fred would feel necessary to tell me that The Sun is now keen to back the SNP at the election if, as you insinuated earlier, that had already been a foregone conclusion. this is a report of the dinner with Mr. Dinsmore, to say this is the outcome of the dinner, and now the editor is going to go back, which I don't think. And again, as I said, Mr. Salmon, this was the top of his agenda, was his ability to convince people that he was right. So, it was natural that he would mention the Sun in a conversation with anyone associated with News Corporation, because that was something that he was very interested in.
Did you have any conversations with the editor of the Sun in Scotland as to which party the Sun in Scotland should back at the next election?
I don't recall any of those conversations, no. But I would point out that it would have been unusual for the Sun to support anyone else other than SNP at that point, given the political situation in Scotland, and this has been reminded to me lately. But it wasn't. I don't think it was a big surprise.
But the Sun had supported the Labour Party in the 2007 election, hadn't it?
I believe so. That was before my time.
Page 107, our page 01748. Again, Michelle to you, JH Confidential, had 1 hour catch-up today. Overall, he believes the debate is extremely quiet and lacks arguments. Feels journos are moving into pricing debates, which is good for regulatory clearance. He called all the key editors last Thursday to explain his decision. Paul Dacre was clear that their campaign was purely motivated for commercial reasons and fears around bundling. JH told him it was not his remit and the EC has already approved. And then you see JR, which is Judicial Review. He doesn't see any rationale for a successful one, and it won't affect the consultation process. Well, possibly there's an irony there that the readers of KRM 18, this bundle, might understand. And then a bit later on 21st March, his team will look at the submissions. It should take 3 to 4 days. Lots will be pure anti-Murdoch ones, and he doesn't expect any groundbreaking issue. If there is one, he will then probably first talk to us, and if needed, OFT. So again, you're going to be given advance notice of anything which might bear on the bid and which you can put input in relation to. Is that right?
Well, he's saying that if a change has to be made to the UIL, if it's a material issue, that we would have to make the change because this is a two-way negotiation. So he would tell us if there is a change, he'll tell us, and then it'll go to the OFT and out for consultation again. I think, again, there is, I would just point, to the first bit and say, this is exactly what we were worried about, is that, you had an editor of a newspaper, of a commercial group, not a chief executive, but an editor, saying that they were purely motivated for commercial reasons, and this is exactly what we were worried about.
Could I understand this, and it may be you won't be able to answer the question. The bid was pursued by News Corporation and for commercial reasons was the subject of objection from some other media competitors. I've understood that. The advice you've received is that the Secretary of State isn't going to speak to you directly, except in formal meetings, and you don't know whether he's speaking to others, and you've said that. But here there's a reference to the key editors being called together to explain his decision. Is that, as it were, a press conference, which would also involve your editors, or is that, that is the editors of the News International papers, or is that some other consultation process as far as you understand it?
I don't think it's a consultation process at all, sir. I think he just called them up bilaterally and talked to them about his decision.
So,
in order to explain what he was doing, as I said, politicians always try to explain what they're doing to the press.
now I don't know whether that's usual or not, but if he's explaining his decision to one of those that are opposing your acquisition, has he ever explained it formally and openly to you?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I think I think taking into context here, there was a huge amount of official submissions and formal communications around this, but I don't know the answer. I don't know what he said to those people on the telephone, if it was the telephone, because I obviously just wasn't there.
Well, I appreciate it. I'm just trying to understand the circumstances that maintain balance here. That's all, that you can't explain.
Page 136, our page 01777. We're now into May 2011. Michelle, to you. JH confidential. Further to his call with him 1 hour ago, JH just called back. He said he might give you a call in the coming days. So this would be Mr. Hunt speaking directly to you. Is that right, Mr. Murdoch?
It seems to say that, yes, this is the middle of May, I think.
That's right. Was there a call between you, a conversation between you?
I don't know. I think I've disclosed in my evidence all of the calls and scheduled things that I can recall or find in my diary. But I can't.
If this were an informal communication by mobile phone, would that be the sort of thing that you'd record in your diary?
Some of them, as the other calls were, that I disclosed to you. So, but I don't recall a telephone call in May. So, unless it's referenced later on in here, I don't remember.
Then
Can you help me with that, Mr. J?
I don't think it's in your diary. Indeed, I'm sure it isn't in your diary.
Okay.
My recollection of it. Page 151-01792. Michelle, to you. We're on the 30th of June now, so it's getting quite close to the fruition of the bid. The public consultation, which I think had just started on the revised UILs, was going to close on the 8th of July. Had a debrief with JH and his team tonight at 7 p.m. before he left to his constituency. He's very happy with the way today went, and especially with the absolutely idiotic debates by Watson and Prescott. Moreover, Labour's Ivan Lewis made very helpful statements throughout, and the strength of the UIL has been widely endorsed. So this is giving you further insight into Mr. Hunt's thinking, isn't it, self-evidently?
I guess so, but this is after the public debate was had, so it was a debrief post the public debate, and nothing new particularly is disclosed. It would seem to me that there was a parliamentary debate about the UIL.
Right.
And this was just, feedback after the public debate.
Page 158-01799, 7th of July. This was 2 days after the Guardian article on the Millie Dowler voicemail deletions. Further insights into Mr. Hunt's thinking was not discussed at the number 10 meeting that Hunt had with the PM, was discussing the two inquiries. Police one led by a judge, and media practices one not with a judge and led by DCMS. So you're being given really confidential information here as to then government thinking as to how what in the end became this public inquiry, but a judge-led inquiry into media practices rather than two separate inquiries. You were given private information as to that, weren't you?
Well, I mean, it seems to be saying that there's. I don't know. I don't remember that part of this. But it seems to me to be saying yes, that this was a discussion around these inquiries that have been out there in the open. But most of this as well is just around, again, the process going forward, the number of petitions coming through, the online pressure group. Avaz had weighed in. There was hundreds of thousands, and as you can imagine, it was an incredibly busy time. So I don't recall exactly reflecting on all of this email.
And then he's telling you, the third bullet from the end, the closure of the News of the World does not affect JH decision, and if anything, help them lead a plurality issue by weakening our voice. One can see the logic of that. The cabinet divisions reporting it in the press are much more to do with the hacking saga rather than the deal itself. He's trying to give you reassurance, isn't he?
I think in his view, and I think he had said publicly, that he didn't think the two issues were separated and that he had a proper process with respect to taking the advice of the OFT and Ofcom on the plurality issues, and that he wasn't going to let his intention, he said this publicly a number of times, I think in the spring, that he saw the two things as not linked. So I don't think this is new or inconsistent with that, with his public statements.
And then the last email, really, at page 160, 01801, the 11th of July, Mr. Hunt was going back to Ofcom and the OFT for further advice, really in the light of revelations coming out of the phone hacking cases, and we can see those for ourselves, can't we?
I think at this point we had already volunteered that it would go to the Competition Commission, and I think the vote went ahead anyway. Indeed, maybe, perhaps we had even withdrawn the offer. I can't remember the exact.
We withdrew the offer just before
that.
To be a vote. Can I ask you about the business ethics of this in the light of the remit of this inquiry, the culture, practice and ethics of the press? In your view, did Mr. Hunt fulfil the quasi-judicial role he occupied?
I think throughout the process, what we saw is that he consulted widely. He took advice from all sides. He followed the advice at every decision point of the OFT and Ofcom. And, I can't say that he didn't do those things. And it was an incredibly rigorous process around the negotiation of the undertaking in an environment where the precise protocol for doing so, negotiating an undertaking like that, was uncharted territory. So he never ultimately adjudicated or decided. But at every step in the process, I can tell you, he followed the advice of the independent specialist that he was going to, and extracted a substantial undertaking, and then extracted strengthenings of it.
But it may or may not afford insight into your own ethical approach. But are you to invite us to say that there's absolutely nothing surprising in KRM 18? This is the exhibit we've been looking at. It's exactly what you'd expect to see. Or are you inviting us to consider that there are surprising things in there relating to departmental conduct and your company's own conduct?
I would say, first of all, that with respect to our own company's conduct, I think, and I think you would find, in a large transaction as public and as hotly contested as this transaction, you would see a very active public affairs function in any large company going after a transaction of this size or nature. And I think that's entirely separate from questions of the ethics of the press. I think this is a question of mergers and acquisitions activities, active public affairs engagement with the relevant policy authorities around those things, just as there's active regulatory engagement with the regulators, and that you would find, active engagement to be the norm rather than the other way around. And with respect to departmental behavior, I really can't say. Again, I don't know the ins and outs of Westminster Protocol, but I do, but I was, we were receiving feedback and information, through our public affairs channel.
Might it be possible to say that the reason why, Mr. Murdoch, you do not appear to be evincing much of any surprise about what we see in this exhibit is that you would expect government to respond favourably to a bid by News International since, or rather News Corps, since support had been given to at least the Conservative Party by the Sun on the 30th of September 2009, and you are somewhat blind to what might appear to the rest of us to be obvious, namely that this is in part a quid pro quo for that support.
As I've said earlier in my testimony, Mr. Jay, there is absolutely not a quid pro quo for that support, and the decision-making around the Sun's policy and who they support, which political parties, etc., I've described to you, and it had absolutely nothing to do with other business interests around the place. The negotiation, the lengthy negotiation and regulatory process, or either sort of political process around the Sky transaction was entirely separate. I simply wouldn't make that trade. It would be inappropriate to do so, and I just don't do business that way.
Okay. Now move on to the issue of press regulation and your philosophy. That I believe your position may be this, Mr. Murdoch, that although you are not in favour of much external regulation, your position is not that there should be no external regulation. Is that right?
Of course, yeah. I think regulation is, often necessary and appropriate in various industries.
Is it your position that, generally speaking, we should be satisfied with the current system, namely that of self-regulation?
Look, I think it's, I have personal opinions about this, and actually as a subject of a lot of press coverage over the last year myself, to be honest, I've had cause for reflection. And I have been concerned with things like the ability to make a case, the ability to reply. I've been concerned with things like prominence of corrections. I mean, The Guardian alone, I think, has had to correct stories about News Corporation over 40 times in the last 10 months or so. None of which seem to have the same prominence as the original story. And that worries me, and I think clearly it shows that somewhere in that code, strengthening needs to occur with respect to accuracy and creating, accountability there. But, I think this is going to be a matter for this inquiry and for the industry. I think statutory regulation is difficult and is a precedent and a slippery slope and all of those things that you would hear. Well, but I don't think I don't think there's an easy answer.
I'm not sure that I really grasp, if you can grasp a slippery slope, that argument. Obviously, if one introduced a statutory regime whereby the government regulated the press, everybody would be horrified. And that's simply not even on the agenda. The only question that has to be decided, and I'd be interested in your view, both from the perspective of somebody who has had responsibility for the governance of a newspaper group, and also from the perspective of somebody who's been experiencing the last year, whether some framework described in a statute but then independently set up and administered might not better fit what this country requires.
I think, sir, that depending on, obviously, the scope and depending on the nature of that statute, obviously the devil is in the details. It's difficult. But I think certainly something stronger, or rather, to me there are two issues. One is there's a real question about clarity with respect to the accountability around news gathering. So when we look at the public interest arguments and things like that are often made, I think greater clarity or certainty for people who are making those decisions about the public interest is important. Simply relying on, the discretion or or I shouldn't say discretion, it should be stronger than that, but simply relying on the attitude of the Crown Prosecution Service or whatever it is seems to be not firm enough. And I'm not a lawyer, and I apologize if I'm not saying the right things. But I think there's another piece here, and that's really with the question of enforcing the law, because we know things that are illegal happened, and they should have been prosecuted, and people should have been brought to account. And for whatever reason, at the News of the World, they weren't in 2006 and 7, and then it took all this time, which is a matter of huge regret. There's those issues, and then there's a question of, and I think the key one here is where the locus of the public interest decision is. And that's very difficult, because it's one that editors and editorial independence guards jealously.
Yes, but if somebody has to be able to review the way in which the press go about its business, at one level you can say, well, the police are there, but that has its own problems, because on the one hand, if one calibrates it too insufficiently finely, then there's a criticism that not enough has been investigated, and you will have doubtless been conscious of the evidence that I heard some months ago about the timing of the 2006 investigation and the counter-terrorism problems that we faced at the time. So there's one hand not going far enough, potentially. On the other hand, there's the risk that if you do what is presently happening, you will get criticisms in the press, which you will doubtless have read, about far too many policemen chasing journalists rather than robbers or burglars or other legitimate police targets. So there's a balance, and it can't always be left, some might say, and I'd be interested for your view, to the police.
I agree with that.
There has to be some other method of regulation that can deal with issues that are less than criminal, but also can make sure that governance is in place to protect the industry from serious problems. And it's a question of how one tries to create that system in a way that binds everybody but does not impact upon the freedom of the press, which everybody, quite rightly, feels is so important, and I am certainly in that group. But how to find that balance is the problem. And if you've thought about it at all, I'd be interested in your thoughts from your particularly unique perspective.
Well, sir, you point out rightly, it's a very difficult question, and it is a balance, and I wouldn't presume to have the answer. However, perhaps I would just say that the things that may be weighed up with respect to when you're considering this would be both a question of clarity around defense, right, or really around criminal defense, and that may be a question of a stronger enshrining of speech rights on the one hand, coupled with a stronger set of consequences and either a self-regulating body or a statutory body that includes the press, but also individuals that are not part of the working press today. So that just as one of the great learnings for us as a business has been not to allow an operating company to investigate itself without absolute transparency to the corporate center, which I think is, one of the learnings from the failure in 2006 and 7 for News Corporation to get to the bottom of this. I also think it is difficult to allow an industry in and of itself to control itself on a voluntary basis, given the concerns that we obviously all have. And I think balancing a strengthening on both sides may be one way to think about it.
Yes, I understand that point, and that actually moves into the next question I was going to ask about that.
Sorry.
No, not at all. Which is that in an industry where everybody is about the same size, then it becomes easier to create a regulatory regime. But where you've got players who are of vastly different size, would you agree, or would you have any observation on the proposition that it becomes much, much more difficult for the independents and the smaller players to control the really very, very big players?
Well, I think, it goes to a broader question here, which is the scope of, or rather, the set that you're actually referring to. Because as we know, the traditional newsprint business is one that will struggle to grow from where it is, and I would argue that there will be fewer newspapers in the future than there are today. I also think that plurality continues to be greatly enhanced by the breaking down of barriers, both in distribution and the creation of content, journalism, storytelling, what have you. So in a digital environment, you have both journalists, if you will, who are producing content for consumption by others, by actors that are down to a scale of 1 unit of 1 person with a laptop, and you have on the other side, Google or News Corp at a much smaller level. And where you draw the boundaries with respect to what is the discourse that you're trying to control, or what is the discourse that you're trying to ensure a set of rules around, is one of the most profound things that this inquiry is going to have to grapple with.
I'm very grateful for that. I agree. Of course, Google is an aggregator rather than a news gatherer as such, I think.
But to suggest the way that search algorithms work is I shouldn't say unbiased, but is the way the search algorithm works affects the results in terms of what's presented, and also the way that any aggregator approaches the set of data that it is compiling is also relevant editorially.
Yes,
I'm sorry to say.
No, I see the point. It may be that to try to find one solution that fits all is not going to be easy. But do you see the value of a distinction between those who aggregate and those who collect and disseminate for profit, and yet a third group of those who blog your one person with a laptop, who is going to fall into a slightly different category?
Although who may be doing it for profit as well. And I think it'll be difficult to avoid arbitrariness in where you draw those lines. Ultimately, in an all-digital, sort of all-media marketplace, ones and zeros going across a network are ones and zeros going across a network. And how we differentiate regulation within that is one of the great challenges for an industry associated with that content.
Yes, and the point you make is valid, and particularly apposite at the moment, where we have to address the problem of flagrant breaches of the law, probably by one person then retweeted many, many times in the naming of a victim of sexual crime. So you're right to bring in the individual, and I'm not suggesting you're not. The question is whether one regime can deal with everything, or whether one's got to try and create a framework that can be customized to different forms of news gathering or presentation?
I think you point out exactly the issue, the republication as well. Like you mentioned, the retweeting of something like that. Once the genie's out of the bottle, if you will, it's very, very hard to see how you then enforce the right of reply. Where are they retweeted from at a second and third instance? How we do that in one country, in one jurisdiction, with respect to that sort of behavior, I think is going to be very challenging. I think ultimately one has to be practical and not say, well, nothing's possible, it's too complicated. And I know that that's going to be something that you reflect on, but ultimately something that is adaptable and I think also doesn't create absurdities in differential rulemaking with respect to what's published online in one place and what's published online in another. But one piece online is okay because it's only online and it's in Canada, but it's being consumed here, and the other piece is not okay because it's online, but it happens to also get printed on a piece of paper. That's a difficult. It's difficult to just slice that off and say, well, if you happen to print it on paper, it'll have these regulations, and if you don't, there'll be other issues.
I agree entirely. That's so in relation to one of the News International titles. There's the Times behind a paywall, digitally and also available in print. But one could equally talk about those that aren't behind a paywall and that are just available.
Very much so.
I'm not sure you've given me an answer, Mr. Murdoch, a solution.
I think it's a little above my pay grade, sir.
I doubt it. Because although I have no idea about your pay grade, I certainly know mine. Right.
May I ask you, have you changed your position on regulation since the views you expressed in the McTaggart lecture of 2009, The Absence of Trust?
I think you learn things as you go along, but the broad thrust of my discomfort with the scale and manner of intervention in the media marketplace is consistent with my views today.
Any fair reading of that is page 02986, paragraph 24 of your statement. Is that although you may be going too far, say that you are against all forms of external regulation. You are not particularly keen on external regulation, are you?
Could you remind me of the paragraph? I'm sorry, Mr. J.
24. Penultimate page of your statement.
Yes, I think regulation, as I said before, is often necessary and an important part of having the set of rules by which society operates itself. And I think in certain industries it's more important than in others to be either heavier-handed or less. And my points in my lecture that day were really confined to the media industry in general in the UK and some of the approach, really a top-down sort of, outcome-driven approach as opposed to a bottoms-up kind of enterprise-led approach, which I would have preferred.
With a fairly scant external regulatory scheme, is that not the logical consequence of what you're saying? In particular, the last line, almost a philosophical position. The only reliable, durable and perpetual guarantor of independence is profit.
That wasn't a comment necessarily on regulation. It was a comment on the ultimate durability of structures, trusts, independent bodies, subsidy, etc., and its ability to be self-sustaining. And I think the qualifiers there, the durable and only qualifiers, are carefully. There are other ways to achieve independence, but I have less confidence in their durability relative to the self-sustaining nature of being able to generate profit in partnership with your customers.
Would you accept at least this proposition, that if one were a believer in fairly weak external controls, the greater the need for robust internal controls?
I think that internal controls, I mean, there's a couple of points I think you're touching on there. I think certainly with respect to the regulation of the television business, really what this is about, and the media business more broadly in the UK, the question there was around how, what was the best way to guarantee the independence of these entities, the independence of their coverage, the independence that they have from factions, from industrial or political factions, and so on and so forth. And that was something that was an important point. I never made an argument that this was never a comment about internal controls, internal governance, compliance, or anything like that, nor was it an argument to say that competition law, enforcing competition infringements, and enforcing the rule of law in general around an organization was in any way to be done down.
So I think my point was a more modest one, really, that if one were to believe in weak external controls, almost from an ideological position, that would tend to suggest a greater need for robust internal controls. Would you accept that or not?
I would accept that that would be the case. However, I do not believe in weak external controls from an ideological basis.
Okay.
So I would be hypothesizing.
Fair enough. Just a couple of questions from other core participants, which I have notified you of, Mr. Murdoch. Did you discuss the developing phone hacking scandal with your father between 2008 and 2010, particularly given the reputational repercussions to your company flowing from the Gordon-Taylor settlement?
Yes, I did. After 2009, when the Gordon-Taylor settlement was resurfaced in The Guardian, I had discussions with him about those things, and those discussions continued from time to time all the way through.
Okay. So 2009 is the first discussion, and we can link that to the publication of the Guardian piece, can we?
Yes. The middle of 2009.
Did you discuss with him the the reputational ramifications for your company as the story, as it were, took wing in the Guardian piece and then subsequently in the United Kingdom?
After the initial story, which again, the assurances internally were given, and we had just appointed chief executive of News International in the summer of 2009, so the day-to-day handling of the matter was in her hands. But there was the initial piece there, which then, as you know, and we discussed earlier today, the company, the News of the World, said that they had investigated it and there wasn't any issues there, etc. And they denied those allegations. So that was there. But the wider reputational damage, if you're going back to the point we touched on this morning, the notion that, the reputational damage was that there was a lot more there, wasn't discussed because we didn't know that there was a lot more there.
Okay.
Until much later, as you know.
In your News International business update of June 2008, you referred to your challenging and innovative titles, publishing outstanding journalism written by great journalists every day of the week. And one example you give is exposés like that of Max Mosley in the News of the World. Why did you include that one?
I would have been given a list of stories to highlight. It was a longer communication around a corporate restructuring we had done, and there's a couple of pages in there, and it was an important part of internal communication. And one of the things that one likes to do in situations like that is affirm to staff that they're doing good work, and I would have been suggested to give a handful of examples of stories to discuss. I would note that it was before the court case around the publication of that story, and had I known then what happened in the court case a month later, 2 months later, I think, with respect to the story being both not true and not in the public interest, I certainly would have included it.
But am I to understand from your evidence that you saw the story when it was published?
I saw it when it was published, yes.
And you were therefore sufficiently comfortable with it that you could say in an internal magazine or publication it was outstanding journalism. Is that correct?
I didn't read it in great detail, but I was in an internal communication around the stories of the month. It was a big story that they had published, and that was that.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Murdoch.
Could I raise a different question? I've talked to you about, I asked you, and Mr. Jay's asked you, about the regulation of the press and the likely or possible successors to the PCC. We've not specifically discussed the PCC, and I don't want to do so unless there's anything you particularly want to say about that subject, and I give you the opportunity to say anything you wish about the Press Complaints Commission. That's the first point.
Would you like me to do that now, sir? Look, I think as an executive and as a just as a business person in a company that invests in journalism, I think, I'd like to have, knowing what I know now, I'd like to have more comfort that training around things like the PCC code and accountability around the PCC, delivered better results, because clearly there have been failings in journalistic practices, and obviously there's been an issue there, but. I think we talked a little bit before about what are the things to strengthen and what not, and I would say having people in and around the PCC who are perhaps having a greater balance that's outside the current working press may be a good thing to have.
All right. Another topic upon which I am asked to make recommendations by my terms of reference relate to a new, more effective policy and regulatory regime which supports the integrity and freedom of the press, the plurality of the media, and its independence, including from government. Much of this afternoon you've been talking about arguments about plurality and debate about that. Have you given consideration to a system that more effectively regulates plurality within the media and its independence, including from government?
The media's independence from government?
Yeah.
I think it's hard to say that one wants to regulate plurality, given that plurality is a state of affairs in a marketplace at a given point in time.
I'm supporting it. I'll read it again. The term of reference is to make a new, more effective policy and regulatory regime which supports the integrity and freedom of the press, the plurality of the media and its independence, including from government, while encouraging the highest ethical and professional standards. So it's for a new, more effective policy and regulatory regime which supports, among other things, the plurality of the media.
Well, I think I understand, and I think with respect to the plurality piece, I would simply say that the first part of protecting plurality or supporting plurality is being crisp around what plurality might be sufficient. Because otherwise, you would simply have the ability of a regulatory body to intervene at any stage if they thought that, if let's say we have 10 newspapers and one newspaper goes out of business, they could say there's been a deficiency in plurality, so we're going to go and do something and intervene to fix that. Whereas the real question is, what is a state of affairs where there is a sufficiency of plurality? And when we engaged on this plurality argument twice, both with respect to the acquisition of a minority interest in ITV and then in the question of the acquisition of the balance of shares in British Sky Broadcasting, one of the problems was achieving a state where we agreed that when the Enterprise Act was done in 2002 or 2003, when this was said, that by inference, plurality was sufficient at that time. So the question becomes, what has happened to plurality in the intervening years, and what is a tolerable decrease in plurality, that could result from business performance, from mergers and acquisitions, and the like. And so I think the baseline is the key thing to understand with respect to sufficiency, because then it will become a much, much more predictable and straightforward and frankly light touch environment with respect to understanding what's expected and what's good for the country. With respect to freedom of the press, we touched on that a little bit earlier, and with respect to independence from government, I think it is I think we have a very independent press. They're not necessarily, they're dependent on other things, some of them, but but I don't think there's a lot of dependency on government now, and I think that's a credit to it.
All right. Mr. Murdoch, thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, and thank you, Mr. Jay.
So we need to take some evidence as read. Statements of Mr. Frederick Michel.
You summarised that prior to starting.
Yes.
The questions you asked Mr. Murdoch about KRM 18.
Yes. It's also important to note in relation to his statement, and this will be clear when it's published online, that some, indeed many of his emails are matched by an immediately antecedent text message from Mr. Adam Smith, the purport of which is reflected in the email, which then goes to Mr. James Murdoch. The inquiry is going to publish on the website as soon as it can exhibits KRM 17, KRM 18, the exhibit to Mr. Michel's statement, and obviously Mr. Murdoch's statement.
Yes, right. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. 10 o'clock tomorrow.
All rise.